It's the morning of December 22nd, 2008. We're on the campus of Rutgers University at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. We're here for the Rutgers program on the governor, the Thomas H. Kane Archive. We begin a series of interviews about Governor Kane today. We're going to start with W. Cary Edwards. Cary was in the legislature in the 1970s, a Republican. In 1981, he became the issues director on Tom Kane's second gubernatorial campaign, a successful campaign. He would then become chief counsel during the first Kane term, and Kane made him attorney general in the second term. Subsequently, Cary became chairman of the State Commission of Investigation, appointed by Governor Whitman, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Let's start with you, Cary. Where were you born?
Paterson, New Jersey. I was living in Ridgewood at Paterson General at the time, and grew up in Bergen County all my life, in about 6 or 7 towns in Bergen County. Our house burned, and we had bankruptcies and economic problems as a kid. So, what did your parents do? My mother has her MSW from Columbia in social. She worked for Bergen County Welfare Center. It's the only person that worked for 38 years in government has no pension, believe it or not. My father was a bookkeeper for AT&T. Her father had gotten him the job. They divorced when I was about 11. We were at, I guess, our lowest economic plight. And she was literally raising 3 kids as a single parent. Because my father was a little economically in absentia. They were in debt. And she was making about half of the amount of money that she was giving out to her welfare clients with 3 kids. And I used to go on her, I used to travel with her when she did her calls in the summer, sometimes, more than just sometimes. It's kind of how I got hooked into government, I guess, when I was real young.
How do you mean?
Okay, hold on, Michael. You don't have your mic on.
Oh.
After all these years.
After all these years, I think the cameraman's going to do it for me. That's
Can you spell prima donna? No. There you go.
Thank you.
What's the roll?
Okay.
I was thinking of Carl Katz.
Yeah.
Did you see that?
I did.
Did you? What do you mean that's how you found your interest in government?
Well, my mother worked for the county government, and she was constantly talking about the welfare system, her job, what she did around the dinner table. I was the oldest of 3 kids. I was the one she talked to all the time about everything, her problems. As a matter of fact, I took over managing the family money at about 16, 17, and put up payment schedules to get them out of debt. And so she was kind of my friend, you know, during that period, and I was hers. And and her interest in government and society and making it better transcended her economic plight. I think she, in many ways, she came from a relatively wealthy family when she grew up, and kind of denied her poverty, if you know what I mean, and believed that everybody had to make a contribution in life, and everybody had to try to leave the world better than they found it. And she was doing it in her way, and kind of instilled that value in me, and I've tried to do it in my way.
Was she a New Jerseyan as well?
Yeah, she lived in New Jersey, and she was originally from the South, though. She had grown up, was born in Georgia and the Carolinas, so was my father. Her father was a very interesting character who had, not more of a character, he was vice president of AT&T and put Telstar up. That was his last project. So it was very interesting. Her side of the family had a very interesting and rich history that she reminded me about all the time. And that's again about making contributions and about just do things every day that leaves the world better than you found it, and you'll have a happy and productive life, regardless of the economics. Economics was a secondary issue, almost to them. It was more than secondary to me, but trying to focus on both was really a pretty good set of values.
Where did you go to high school?
I went to St. Luke's High School in Ohocus. I had my mother
Public or parochial?
Parochial. My mother had been had converted to Catholicism because she thought I needed discipline in my life. And if you understand the Catholic Church believes you should suffer for the sake of suffering. So she thought that those principles, and parochial school was a very good place for a very headstrong, undisciplined young man. As the oldest, and she liked the religion itself, and there was a priest in Ridgewood that really convinced her of the value of that, and so she became a Catholic, and I went to parochial schools for 22 years.
What distinguished you in high school, if anything? What were you known for?
I worked 60 hours a week outside in stores, and I was kind of the workaholic from an economic perspective. I worked at a clothing store, and I worked at a luncheonette that was a soda fountain as a soda jerk. I worked 20 hours at Lobel's and about 30 to 40 hours at this luncheonette, and so nothing really distinguished me much except the amount of money that I could earn on an hourly basis, and helping her with my brother and my sister, because my parents were divorced then. Very tough time for her, and she depended on me a lot for a lot of things. So it was an interesting and challenging time, but not a bad time.
We're talking about the 1950s and 60s?
60s. Yeah, I graduated 62 from high school, so it was 58 to 62. And it instilled in me there's a whole lot of social values that come out of that. Single parent, women, discrimination, her earning capacity. I was keenly aware of all those things as a teenager. Most people wouldn't have been exposed to all that, and the problems of divorce and the problems with the laws and how well they protect various people, women, children in that world. Who were the important ones in the divorce? Was it the children or was it the participants? And it was usually the participants, and the children were the pawns in that process. A whole lot of things kind of played in my life during that period that were kind of dynamic.
Did you go right on to college?
I had no dollars. I found a school in Oklahoma that a friend of mine was going to called Southwestern State College that would accept me. I could charge the first semester. A friend of mine was going, it was a big school for pharmacy, and I wanted to be a lawyer. So I went and I signed up, had to take the ACT test when I got out there because they didn't do SATs. I passed, and they let me charge the first semester. And it was in Weatherford, Oklahoma on Route 66. This is before the interstate highway system. So that was a lot of fun all by itself. The different culture was wonderful. I loved it. But I worked in a gas station from midnight to 8 in the morning. I could earn 10 cents more an hour, 55 cents an hour versus 45 cents. So I had to repay my tuition and board, which I did. Came home for Christmas. Greyhound lost all my clothes. Took a Greyhound bus home. It was the only way I could get home. And there was a lot of problems at home with my mother and my brother and my sister, economic problems and others. So I dropped out. I left. I had about a 2.9 average, and came back. I went to work for Bamberger's. Now, Bamberger's was a division of the Macy Corporation, but Louis Bamberger was had sold Bamberger's to the Macy Corporation, but he was a philanthropist with no family, and he had given all his money to Newark in the state of New Jersey. He had also set up a scholarship program for his executive trainees, and I was in what they call the prep squad. And I signed up to go to Seton Hall at night in Patterson. They had a Patterson campus. I'd been accepted on transfer to Penn State. That's where I really wanted to go. And they had one full-time scholarship they gave out. And I won the scholarship out of 150 other kids. So it paid tuition and books and expenses, not room and board. I retook my SATs. I got accepted at Princeton, but I had to keep working, and it didn't pay room and board. So I went to Seton Hall, and it paid all of my those expenses. And I kept working as an executive for the Macy Corporation through Bamberger for the next 4 years.
So you graduated Seton Hall. In what? What did you study there?
Business, a marketing management major, business major. Took my SATs, LSATs for law school. I had gotten to know the dean of students, who was a priest by the name of Father Balwick there, who I had made the advisor for my fraternity. I was president of my fraternity, and I had joined the fraternity in Oklahoma and transferred to the chapter at Seton Hall, and he knew I had done pretty well in my SATs, and I wanted to go to law school. I had no money again. I was back in that scenario. He said, "How would you like to be an assistant in the dorms? You get room, board, and tuition for law school." I was accepted at Seton Hall and a couple of other law schools. I took it and spent 3 years. That paid for my law school, and I wound up being the assistant dean of students for resident students. Designed a course that I taught for the history department, which they paid me for.
Course in what?
History. It was called A Student in the Law. We were trying to make transform the university system into for discipline purposes and student activities and student ethics into a system that would be acceptable to students on the university. And we did that, and the class designed it, literally. It was a judicial system, it was a set of standards, it was how they could control themselves. And after I left, I still taught the course for a couple more years.
Any favorite professors at Seton Hall or at law school?
The law school? Seton Hall Law School at that point in time had been formed in the early 50s. It was, if you remember, this was 1967, 68, 69, Kent State, riots, there was a lot going on. We led our own little revolution at the law school during that period, my class and myself. They didn't have a student government association. They had a law fraternity. I became president of the law fraternity, and we led our own little minor upheaval and to change the school. And I had gotten friendly with Bishop Doherty since I was working at the university campus level, and he was just a pretty good guy. He said, "I need some public demonstrations about what you think is wrong with the law school." So we led a couple of, I wouldn't call them, demonstrations is the best way I would describe them.
What were your political leanings at the time?
I was not affiliated, Republican or Democrat. I was probably more of socially, I was probably more of a Democrat. But physically, I didn't like the way money was being spent within the confines of government, and blamed that on poor policy and the Democrats as having a bad philosophy. So I was always split between being a Republican on fiscal matters and more of a Democrat, I think, on social issues.
What did you do after law school?
I wanted to practice law immediately, didn't want to clerk, wanted to represent people, wanted to help people solve problems, all the things that I had seen in life. Got a job in a firm that, by absolute accident, had represented local governments exclusively. It was a municipal government practice. I got a call from my brother-in-law, who was had just made this partnership with this fellow in Morris County, who did municipal work. I had clerked for a firm in the summer that had done municipal work. He says, "I don't know the difference between an ordinance and a resolution." And I had just gotten married, taken the bar exam, and had a couple of offers from 2 or 3 firms. And he said, "Can you come in and help me? My partner just got hepatitis. He's in the hospital for 6 months. He'd eaten some bad lobster. And you can help. He'll do the work, but kind of back him up." I liked him very much, and I liked the firm, so I stayed. And we did municipal work. I did for the next 3 years, about 60% of my practice. The other was a corporate business practice that I focused on. And I became an aide to Pete Thomas.
Who's Pete Thomas?
He was a senator, a
state senator.
He was with Lumbuno and Tompkins, which was a big law firm back then. They just passed new ethics laws in the early 70s that precluded a lot of lawyers from being part of the legislature. So he joined our small firm because we didn't have those conflicts, and we represented local governments predominantly. And he needed an aide. So I then went with him for 2 years every Monday and sat in the Senate. It was at the time that Bill Cahill was governor. He was proposing his blue ribbon income tax, which becomes very significant to me later on and in my career. He was reorganizing the court system because I was a prominent lawyer, and I did most of his research for him, and really got involved in state government. That's how I got involved in the state government side of things.
You say that the ethics laws kept certain lawyers out of the legislature?
Yes.
What kind of lawyers?
It was conflicts of interest legislation was passed in the early 70s that prohibited lawyers who worked for big firms, this was the consequence of it, from being able to be legislators because their firm's list of clients was every major corporation in New Jersey. So every time they had to vote on a business bill, they were now put in direct conflict, whether they had a specific one or didn't have a specific one.
It kept them from being legislators or from being legislative aides?
No, it kept them being legislators. And that's why Pete Thomas had to leave Lumbuno or resign from the Senate. It was the time when Warren Wilentz resigned from the Assembly.
Robert
Wilentz resigned from the Assembly because Wilentz's firm had those same conflicts. That's why he dropped out of government. Same law. This Pete Thomas went as a partner in our firm because he didn't have those conflicts because we represented 70-80% of our business was local governments, and they didn't have those conflicts. It was the business clients base that gave conflicts to those legislators.
What does a municipal lawyer do?
Represent local government, borough attorney, planning board attorneys, boards of health attorneys, boards of adjustment, county authorities, and this firm had developed a specialty in representing municipal clients. And I enjoyed that because it gave me the opportunity to be, and local government's very creative. The municipal statutes that run local governments leave a lot to interpretation. And I found I could be very creative as a lawyer for various government agencies and still be very productive in changing policy and having my imprint, let's say, on the policies of those agencies and what they did. As a matter of fact, I tested that later. I ran for the council in my own town. I was curious as to whether I'd have a bigger impact as a lawyer for a town or a councilman in a town. I had a bigger impact as a lawyer than as I did as a councilman, in fact.
Pete Thomas,
right.
From what county?
He was from Morris County. He ultimately, when Bill Cahill's term was up, he was put on the bench. He became a judge and moved down to Monmouth County, and I think he served up until the mid-90s as a member of the Superior Court.
And you were his legislative aide, so you would accompany him to Senate sessions?
Drove him to every Senate session and would do a lot of his research on, he was on Judiciary Committee. His legal background put him in very heavily in the lawyer side, legal issues involved in the Senate's deliberation on no-fault insurance, that period, the income tax, reorganizing the court system, a bunch of constitutional amendments that happened in the early 70s that created our Superior Court today, eliminated district courts, county district courts. That all had its genesis in that era.
How'd you like the legislature?
How did I like it?
Yeah.
There was a lot of things I liked about what it could do and how it fit. I loved learning about it during that period, and I loved learning about it when I was a member of the legislature about 6 years later. I'm glad I left. The legislature creates a get reelected mentality to it that I didn't like, and it lost its focus sometimes on the value of issues and solving problems, I found. And so I found it difficult to deal with that on a daily basis, constantly worrying about running for reelection and having to try to do justice to the quality of the legislation. And when Tom gave me the opportunity to really have a profound impact on public policy, it was the best of both worlds for me.
What were your duties as an aide to Pete Thomas? besides driving him?
Well, driving was one. I met him. I would meet him down on 287, right off.
Did you live in Oakland at the
I
time?
lived in Oakland. Yes, I've lived in Bergen County all my life. So I'd drive down. I'd park my car. Get in his. He drove a really great GTO during that period. I remember I loved driving his car. So I drove his car. We'd go to Trenton every Monday, and I would sit next to him. If you remember how the structure of the Senate is, the senator sits here and his aide sits next to him. As a matter of fact, Pete Schluter was the guy next to me, a much younger.
Bill Schluter
was much younger.
He was a senator?
He was a senator at the time. Yes, he was. And another guy from Bergen County who was not much older than I was, Cabby Hollenbeck at the time, who's now a sitting judge, ran for Congress and did a whole lot of other things. And we were the same age almost, so we had a lot of fun hanging around. And he kept saying, "What am I doing here?" He was trying to learn the system as I was.
So aside from driving him, you say you helped him
research the income tax bill. I ran for the Assembly in '77, and in '77 it was the big year that Brendan Byrne had passed the income tax, had taken a very strong position for it, as he had to, and Ray Bateman taking a very strong position against it. Cahill had commissioned a Blue Ribbon Commission on the income tax, and matter of fact, I had to review every single word of that Blue Ribbon Commission. I understood all the dynamics of Cahill's Blue Ribbon Commission on income tax. It was the superior, in my opinion, tax structure, income tax structure for the state. It didn't have a lot of the political gimmicks in it. It had come up for a vote. Tom Kean was Speaker at the time of the Assembly. Ray Bateman was the President of the Senate at the time, and in the Senate. I'm trying to remember the name of the fellow who moved it. Had been a legislator in my district. Anyway, he moved the bill. I was on the floor that day, but I had read every word, given memos to Pete about what this package was, how significant and what a fair tax package it really was, my opinion, which most people didn't disagree with at the time, and it fell about 8 or 10 votes short of passing.
Did Pete support it?
No, he did not. The Republicans, most of them, a big chunk of them, didn't, and the Democrats didn't for political reasons that had to do with Bill Cahill being governor at the time. And they fell about 8 or 10 votes short in the Assembly, which is where the taxing bills have to begin. That became very significant in 1977 when I ran for the Assembly, because I was a supporter of the concept of a fair income tax. And Brendan's income tax, I thought, was fundamentally okay, but it had a number of political gimmicks in it, including the rebates and the checks, the inefficiencies that were in it, the political compromises he made at the time or needed to make in order to put the package together. So when I was running for the Assembly, the Republican Party was against the income tax. I took a bunch of people from my district and I said, okay, you guys study this. I think this is a good package. And I want to support the income tax concept with some changes that I may make in Brendan's package that had to do with rebate checks and some of what I thought were gimmicks in it, but not fundamentally the concept of an income tax. The Republican Party had handed out bumper stickers, and it had, in our case, it was had my name on it and had no income tax. So I cut off the no income tax. The group I gave it to, which were some prominent Republican business people and former legislators, when they got to reviewing or the fact package I gave them, said there really is no choice. This is the right kind of tax for us, right kind of way to raise revenues. The income tax was, and we don't think anyone who doesn't support it can get elected. So they allowed me to support it in my district and still support me, and I came out publicly in favor of it after I called Ray and said, "You're nuts." He came out with the Bateman-Simon plan about 2 weeks later that Brendan, I think, had labeled the BS plan, and properly so. because Ray had taken a position in the primary. He could run the state of New Jersey for 4 years without an income tax, and he couldn't do it.
Let's go back to the period where you were an aide. As an aide, did you have any contact with Governor Cahill?
Yes, a little bit. They recruited me, as a matter of fact, for to maybe go in the counsel's office, and I turned them down.
Why?
Why did I turn them down?
Yeah.
Because I liked what I was doing. I had the benefit of government. I had the benefit of learning local government in the law firm. I had made an arrangement with my firm that was economically very lucrative. They paid me on how much I billed and collected, not a salary. And I put a lot of hours in. So I billed and collected maybe 2 or 3 times what other people did. So the economics, I was just married. I had all the experience in government I could want at local government levels. I had a lot to learn still at that level. Working with Pete in the Assembly and the Senate gave me the state exposure, and I thought it was more prudent for me to try to find get my legal career more well established.
What did you think of Cahill?
I liked him a lot. He was straight shooter, right at your face. He really was honest, candid internally. I thought he was moderate on social issues. That's why he lost to Sandman in the primary, I think. Philosophically, I liked him. I liked his income tax proposal. I thought he had a lot of guts in putting it forward. And I thought he was a great governor for that reason.
So Pete Thomas goes on the bench at the end of the Cahill years. What do you do between 74 and 77?
Start my own law firm.
Where?
In Oakland, with a friend of mine, Bob Gallo. I was allowed, some family reasons why I didn't stay in the firm I was with, which had to do with that same brother-in-law. And
falling out with him?
No, not with him. If I stayed there, it wouldn't have worked well. Much to the chagrin of the other lawyers, municipal lawyers there. So they let me take 2 or 3 municipal clients where I've been doing the work, and the clients agreed. So I opened up in Oakland with Bob Gallo, and I had 3 or 4 towns in Morris County I was representing, or planning boards or boards of health, in Boonton particularly, and East Hanover, and some municipal clients. So I had a base, and we built the law firm then from like 74 through 81 when I left to about 6 or 10 lawyers, and I continue to do municipal work as half of my practice, and corporate and commercial work as the other half of my practice.
Why did you run for the Assembly?
I never planned to run for office. In Oakland, I moved into town, bought a house, opened my firm. I moved into a new subdivision. The subdivision wasn't finished, and the developer went bankrupt. All my neighbors came knocking on my door and said, "You're a lawyer, municipal lawyer, you could help solve this problem. Our streets aren't paved." So I went down to the municipal building, got out the planning board file and the other files, and I found $75,000 in CDs in the town's name they didn't know they had. I then went to the mayor and council and said, "I found this. You have $75,000 in reserve. You can help fix this problem, and I think you should put another $75,000 into it and finish this subdivision. It's about 20 houses, and it's not a big issue." They did. They agreed with me, and then they knocked on my door and asked me to run for council about 2 months later. One of the councilmen was resigning for business reasons, and they wanted me to run for the unexpired term. They wanted me to run for a 3-year term. I said, I just opened a law firm. I don't know if I can do this. And I always wondered what it would be like to be the elected representative versus the lawyer, and which one had more impact. So I ran for council.
What year?
1975. And I won. We did not win control. We were still tied. The next year, I ran for the unexpired term. The next year, I had to decide right away if I was going to run again. So I did. I ran for a 3-year term. We won that election, took control, and I took control of the finances for the town, the budget.
You ran as a Republican?
As a Republican.
Why did you run as a Republican? What had you forged some kind of bond with the Republican Party by that point?
People in town, yes. And Bergen County was a Republican county also. And I settled in Oakland because legally I could do Morris and Passaic County from Oakland and Bergen County. I'd always been in Bergen County. That was part of the reason. But the group that had taken control of Oakland that I was objecting to their policies was a far right-wing to John Birch group. They were independents, but they were really Republicans. And I said, they don't represent me, and they don't represent what the Republican Party should stand for. That's how I and the Republicans were running a challenge against them.
Okay, and you say that you found out that a councilman has less influence than a municipal attorney.
I found out two things. One, I didn't have as much influence as a councilman as I did as the attorney for the town. And two, that all government is controlled by the finances. That becomes very important because in the governor's office later on, I brought the budget out of the treasurer's office and put it in the governor's office. I wrote the budget, manually wrote the budget for 2 or 3 years in Oakland to learn about financing. And I found out that if you control the money in government, you control public policy in the town. Because real policy, not stated policy, not promises. Matter of fact, I taught that here at Eagleton in the 90s. I had a course for a year, and it was on that very principle. And I found out that I could really control the town through the financing, that I couldn't, even more so than I could control it as the attorney or as a councilman. Because if I understood the numbers and understood financing, I could influence public policy greater than in any other way. And we straightened the town out. I got a lot of things I wanted done in the town, and Tom Kane called me on the phone and asked me if I would support him in 1977 in his race for governor against Ray Bateman.
Let me stop you there.
Pardon me? I'm a councilman during this period.
When did you first meet Tom Kane?
Back in 71, 72, he was speaker when I was an aide with Pete Thomas. And I had met him. I liked him a lot during that period of time. I knew Ray Bateman very well, too. Here we are, fast forward to 77. Tom Kane calls me on the phone and wants me to support him. Ray Bateman calls me on the phone and wants me to support him. I decide I'm going to support Tom. I like Tom better. I thought he was a better
person or
as a person and as a candidate. I thought he had a much broader view of the world than Ray did, philosophically and politically. And governmentally, and one that was very attached, very akin to me. He was hedging on the income tax, would not come out against the income tax. Ray was way out there on the other side of it, and I had told you I had studied that and had my own opinions about it. So I decided to support Tom. Within the confines of politics in Bergen County, who got the organization column was under debate, significant debate. Tom Kane was losing that battle to Ray Bateman. The Tom Kane people, all of us who had decided to support him, we needed to put together a ticket to give Tom a column on his own. So we all sat in a room and decided what we were going to run for. Literally. Who's going to run? I didn't want to run for freeholder. I said, I don't want to be in the legislature, but I'll run for the legislature. You can put my name on the ballot. Ultimately, the county chairman in that county leaned more towards Tom Kane.
Who was that? Do you recall?
Dick Vanderplaat. And Tony Statiel, people who remember politics in Nelson Gross era, was backing Ray Bateman. He was on the outside. His criminal issues had gone away, and he was fighting to take control of the Republican Party again.
Nelson Gross.
Tony Statiel was.
Okay.
Nelson had been in jail. Nelson had dropped out of politics and was gone. But Tony was coming back, and he was a Ray Bateman supporter, and Dick Vanderplaat liked Tom but wouldn't cross the line and actually do something. But what he did do was he put all of the candidates, the Bateman slate and the Kane slate, in one column. So myself and Walter Kern and John Spazzieri and Gus Reese were running for the assembly in one column.
Why?
To give Tom a chance so he wasn't iced out on the organization ticket. So now, here, I put my name up. I don't think I'm going to win, I'm just a stand-in candidate here. All of a sudden, the day of filing, the chairman puts us all in one column. I'm the candidate running for the assembly. And I'm a Tom Kean supporter. So I stayed on the ticket. I won that primary. Along with Walter Kern, we beat the incumbents, and Tom lost. In
Why?
my district, in District 40.
Why did the Kean assembly candidates win, but Kean lost?
We ran a better campaign. We did. I'm very honest. They were against the income tax. They were old incumbents, John Spazzeri and Gus Reese. Gus Reese ultimately dropped out, and the mayor of Elmwood Park jumped in his spot. They filled him in. And Walter Kern and I won, based on a better campaign. And we were all in one column. So it wasn't like they even knew who the incumbents were. And if you won in District 40 in the primary, you couldn't lose the general election. It was that heavily a Republican area. So I wind up in the assembly, and Tom winds up on the outside.
You say you ran a better campaign than the incumbents? You knocked off the incumbents in the primary? What kind of campaign did Kean run in the primary?
Tom's problem always had been that he never had, this is very important, that's the quality of his governorship. He never could garner the support of the county organizations, the chairmen. And he didn't do it in this case, and Ray did. And that's why Ray won.
Why couldn't Tom do that? Did he not see that was necessary?
He knew it was necessary, but there was a level of compromise politically that Tom wouldn't do. For whatever reason, he never would do it. And it's what made his ability to be absolutely independent as a governor when he finally won. It's the same thing happened in 1981. History will show that I think 19 or 20 of the county chairmen all supported Pat, well, they support a couple of people, Bo Sullivan or Mayor Pat Kramer. Bill Gormley, myself, along with Mr. Linke and Harold Hodis and Brendan Byrne, passed a piece of legislation in the spring of 1981 that put the candidates for governor in one column and the candidates for the United States Senate. Brendan wanted to do it to give John Degnan a shot. We wanted to do it to give Tom Kean a shot. The county chairman and both Pat and Bo had no idea that was even happening or how to combat it. So all of a sudden, Tom Kean in 1981 was in one column. And there were 10 of us in the assembly, Republicans, or 12 of us, and a bunch of Democrats that had put that bill together and got it passed.
What was it called, that initiative or that effort?
It was the Open Primaries Act, the Open Public Primaries Act, which put candidates for the United States Senate and governor, statewide office, in one column without party designation. And so it allowed Tom and all the other candidates to be in one column.
Is that the way it is today?
No, it was overturned in the 90s as being unconstitutional because the legislature can't control the political parties. The parties are separate, and they can't dictate to the parties how to do that. But Tom had I think only Gene McCaffrey down in Gloucester County had endorsed Tom. I think he had won one convention over the objection of the county chairman in a maneuver that was, I don't remember the details of. But it allowed Tom to run on an equal footing. And he ultimately won without any support from the Republican organization, which meant when he became governor, he was free to do really what he thought was best with reference to appointments, and the influence of the party apparatus was non-existent on him.
Let's go back to 77. Kean loses the primary in part because he can't attract the support of county chairs.
Correct.
Bateman wins the primary. At that point, who did you think would win the general election?
Byrne.
Why?
Because Bateman could not run the state of New Jersey for 4 years without an income tax. It was a one-issue
Did the
campaign.
voters know that?
It was a one-issue campaign. Yes, they did. In my opinion, Michael, if you go back, that issue, we had legislators sleeping on the desk for 2 years. There was one issue in that campaign and no other issue, and it was the income tax.
It had passed the year before.
It had passed the year before. There was a constitutional amendment that was on that ballot and been voted on the year before. I believe the public, and rightfully so, was going to, and there was no other conclusion you could come to. Ray was wrong. He didn't have to say, I can run the state of New Jersey for 4 years without an income tax to win that primary. He had it won without it. But he said it because that was the conservative Republican line. And it proved to be true. Brendan won the primary, and he did have 4 or 5 candidates, but he still won the primary after having been one term burned because he had credibility because of the honesty and accuracy of that issue. If you looked at the numbers as it affected the people in the state, it was a benefit, even in Bergen County, a significant benefit because of New York taxes and credits you got. It was a fairer tax, and there was no way you could come up with any other answer. Ray kept trying, and he kept failing. And I knew he was going to fail. I knew Brendan was going to win that election.
And you won your assembly election
We won, Walter Kernan and I
simultaneously.
won simultaneously. Now, I'm in the legislature. Tom's not. He asked me how I get in public office. I had no intention of ever being there. Now I'm there. So I decided to stay.
Were you let down?
No, I wasn't let down, but I was scratching my head and said, how am I going to be an assemblyman, a councilman in my town, run a law firm, and make a living? I resigned the council position. I stayed in the assembly. As I said, I had a municipal government practice, and my partner had a litigation practice, which was not incompatible with the ethics laws. And so I stayed and found that I could really work with in the legislature as a legislator. And I spent that first year, I didn't do anything, didn't introduce bills. I just wanted to watch and see what is this role that I have. And I used to call Tom periodically. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? How do I do this?
What was Tom doing?
He was home with the kids. Literally home with the kids. He was running the real estate operations for his family's real estate holdings. It was a real estate holding company that he was the president of.
Was he plotting a run for governor again?
Absolutely. No question about it. Absolutely. He was plotting a run for something. Whether it was governor or United States Senate was always a question. But since I had gotten to know him in '77, I kept in touch with him during the next 3 years and would periodically ask him for a little advice here or there about the legislature, and he would give it to me.
Did he keep himself visible after?
In a very subtle way, in a substantive way, which I liked also. And he would periodically come down and speak to we were really a minority, 26 of us, I think, at the time. And he would come down and, at some of our conferences and give us some insights into how he thought some touchy issues that we were wrestling with at the time needed to be handled. And I just kept in touch. And I really worked hard at my legislative world and learning how to do it and figuring out, did I like the legislature? Did I want to stay there? What was I'd gotten leadership that next year, and I got to be the number 2 leader at the end of my term.
That was quick.
That was very quick. And I had to make a decision then. This is part of the judgment. Dean Gallo was the minority leader at the time. He was going to run for Congress. And I figured if Tom did a good job as governor, which I believed he would, I would probably wind up being speaker because Dean would run for, so I was the number 2 person at the time. And Bill was behind me as number 3, Gormley. And, but Tom made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
We'll get there. As a municipal attorney, how did you balance the constraints in serving in the assembly with going to municipal meetings and council meetings? How did you straddle potential conflicts?
It worked. It was a great practice for me. I wound up doing matrimonial work and my municipal work because most municipal work's at night. Legislature finishes in, relatively early. I can usually get back for all my municipal meetings. I kept staying in the courtroom. I kept doing divorce work. This is the way I could also schedule that and still be in the legislature, where the normal litigation practice you couldn't. The conflicts issues really didn't exist. The way the conflicts laws were written, since I was representing the public interest in both cases, it was almost never deemed a conflict, unless it was a piece of legislation specifically about a client town that was either an earmark or designed for them or had some special benefit for them. So I didn't find, and I checked regularly with the issues, but I was also on the municipal government committee. And Ozzie Pilecki was the chairman. And Ozzie didn't care much about it, so he let me run the committee because I knew the issues very well.
Let's talk about Kane a little bit during this period. As I recall, he became a commentator on television to some degree.
He did.
He was the Republican to Dick Leone's
That's correct.
Democrat on NJN.
That's correct.
How important was that in keeping his name out there, do you think?
I think it was more important in learning how to deal with the electronic media for him. I think that level of experience in dealing with as a commentator was as valuable as the exposure. It did keep his name out there, but I don't know that it kept his name out there enough that it was instrumental in his election. I did think he knew the print media very well, Tom, from his years, and that was the dominant media during the 70s when he was Speaker. But learning more about the electronic media was I think, the best value to him that he got out of that NJN experience. I also think, because it was Dick Leone and him, they were talking on high planes about important issues. And I think it added to his credibility on issues, not just for politics. Because Dick Leone is also a formidable intellect on his own right on government issues, and probably one of the biggest losses to the state of New Jersey is his lack of ability to have been involved more profoundly. I think that comparison was good. It created a good aura among the policymakers. You know NJN, you do it now. There's 10 or 20,000 people in New Jersey who are intimately involved. We all watch NJN, we always have. And to those policymakers, it was a very important influence. And I think it enhanced Tom's standing because of the level to which he debated those issues.
Did Brendan Byrne appoint Tom Kane to the Highway Authority back in that period of time?
He did something, I don't remember. Yes, there was some appointment like that happened. Was the Parkway, the Turnpike?
Well, the Highway Authority ran the Parkway, and the Turnpike Authority ran the Turnpike, and I think Kane may have been appointed to the Highway Authority.
There was an appointment that Brendan did during that period with Tom. I don't remember what it was, but
what distinguished your 4 years in the Assembly in your mind?
Mine?
Yeah.
The work we did on substantive legislation, and in which we could NJ Transit, the formation of NJ Transit. Bob Mulcahy, Harold Hodes came to me, and a bunch of other Republicans when they were trying to put the NJ Transit bill together. And Lou Gambasini was the transportation commissioner at the time. He lived in my district in Ridgewood. And they asked me if I would support the bill. I went and knocked on Lou's door in Ridgewood one Saturday morning and spent 8 hours with him going through the formation of NJ Transit and the pros and cons with him. I went back and I studied it, and I came to the conclusion it was we should do this for reasons that you just can't imagine. It was very obvious when I got through looking at it. I liked Lou. I thought he was an honest and forthright guy, and he gave me good information. It proved to be absolutely accurate. I then went together to try to put together 8 or 10 votes in the Assembly, because the Hudson County delegation was trying to hold up the governor, Byrne, and Harold and the staff for various things they wanted in order to put the votes together in the Assembly for NJ Transit, the creation of it.
Transportation-related things or other things?
Just money for whatever they wanted it for. They always had a list in Hudson County. Democrats did.
Did other legislators go spend 8 hours with a cabinet officer to learn about an issue, or were you unusual?
Well, I did it on major issues, particularly. Like that was a major issue. That was a big deal. The formation of the quality of our transportation system was down the toilet in reality, and the formation of NJ Transit was vitally important. And I did it all the time. Various other legislators did to some degree. If you took all 80 of us, nobody did more, I don't think, than what I did. But there were other people that worked that hard on bills or things they were interested in. And we put those votes together. And the creation of NJ Transit, the senator who was running that was Frank Herbert, who was a senator also from Bergen County, another section of Bergen.
He was a Democrat.
He was a Democrat. And Frank and I worked for about 6 months together to try to put the votes and deal with the issues that they had on the Democratic side and decisions they had to make and compromises. They wanted to be sure they didn't upset me or my group of votes that I had in the Assembly as they were passing it through the Senate. And it was a great experience. I got some criticism, or I started to get some criticism from the Republicans that somehow this was, we should be challenging this. I said, what are you, nuts? We need to be for things, not just against things. And when it's something that's right, be for it. And don't make any trades. Don't ask for any bills to be signed. Just be for it. If you want to win control of this legislature, if you want to be meaningful in government, this is what you do.
Has that quality been lost in Trenton?
Oh, yes. Hundreds of reasons that happened in the 90s. Well, we were moving in that era during the 70s and throughout the 80s and Tom Kaine's era of giving power to the legislature and them exercising their independent rights. As much as I fought with Alan Karcher, and Alan Karcher's got a bunch of faults, and we had some great Democratic legislators and some great Republican legislators during that period who were trying to exercise their independent standing, which they had during that period, to make judgments as an independent branch of government. And it was important that the legislature do that during that era. And they were doing it great guns during the 70s. That's why Brendan got in trouble. They were trying to exercise their independence, and Brendan was right in the middle of that during his first term, and he had an important issue. And the politics and all of those things that get involved, there was an evolution in the legislature that was happening. One man, one vote had come in. The power of the party to control legislative votes disappeared. Legislators got elected on their own merit and their own fundraising. It was only 4 counties that could still control the election. Somerset and the Republicans, Hudson and the Democratic Party, Camden County. They were, maybe one other county could control who the legislators were because the districts crossed county lines. And we raised our own money during that period. So the standing of individual legislators, their opinions, their power, their capacity was never greater than it was from 1974 to about 1995. And you had some great legislators that came along during that period.
Who?
Alan Karcher. Politically, even John Russo. Some really talented people. Tom Kaine, Ray Bateman, Frank Herbert, I think was a great legislator. Al Burstein on the Democratic side. I'm missing a bunch of really, really good people. And they all had opinions, and they voiced those opinions. And we really fought about issues and the independence of the legislature as the third branch, which is very necessary in this state.
Well, that still occurs, does it not?
No.
No? No. Why not?
Since 95, the control of the legislature has been by people not elected to the legislature. The PACs, the change in the financing laws, took the capacity of a legislator to raise his own money, stand there independently on his own, and put it in the hands of people who raise the money for him, and people behind the scenes. And they now dictate dramatically to legislators how they're going to vote.
Who does? Interest groups? Special interest groups?
County chairman.
County chairman.
People who raise the money.
Well, the leaders raised money too.
Cary in Bergen County. My good friend from Camden County.
George Norcross.
Glenn Paulson on the Republican side, who raises all the dollars and Glenn's a good friend of mine from the Republican side. But they raise the dollars. Legislators very rarely come with their own standing and get elected on their own since about 1995.
Let me ask you for about a couple other people who may or may not have been key legislators back in '78 when you took office. Dean Gallo, what was he like?
Well, Dean was from Morris County, open primary county, knew how to get elected, was one of those independent standing people, man of his word, would stand up for if he told you he was going to go stand on that spot, you could guarantee he would be on that spot. Not the most studious of legislators, where he read every word of a bill, depended on staff to tell him, but made good political and good public policy decisions. And the one thing about the legislators in that era, they would all go only so far on the political expediency of issues. They would stop if the public interest was strong enough, and they would always fall on the side of public interest, which is how we survived in the Kane years and we passed so many bills. Because the Alan Karchers, the John Russos, or the Orecchios, or the other legislative leaders during that era would ultimately deal with the issue and make fundamentally the right decision.
And that's lost.
And that's lost.
Joe LaFonte.
Joe LaFonte was an old-time Hudson County Democratic machine politician. I said there was a few counties where that didn't exist, and Hudson County was one of those. But even the Chris Jackmans of that era, who controlled that particular county, did have a point where the whole legislative body would say, no, you can't go that far. You've got to stop at some point. And even the Chris Jackmans or the LaFontes, and I was also at the tail of the Abscam world, in which a lot of people were run out who shouldn't be there in the legislature from an older school during that era.
Wayne Dumont.
Independent legislator, going to do what he thought was right. One of those leaders that you may like him, you may not like him, you may not like his principles, where he stood, but he stood where he said he was going to. He was tough and he cared. And the legislature was full of those people then.
Joe Merlino.
Another one. Mercer County, tough Democrat, knew the Democratic machine. Stockman, too, who was also in that.
Jerry
Stockman. Ultimately, they were going to stand. They would only go so far politically, and they would stop and say, the public interest demands that this be done.
Jim Dugan.
Jim Dugan was the old school. I don't know that I put Jim Dugan. Jim Dugan fought for power in the legislature, but I don't know that Jim Dugan had that same sense of public policy. It was the old school. He was fighting for his own power and control as a state chairman.
Pat Dodd.
Pat Dodd, good legislator. Understood that would ultimately make the right decision, Pat.
Al Burstein, you've mentioned.
Oh, Prince. Still a prince today. Cared about public policy, fought for election reform. Just battles that you couldn't win, just to keep rolling the stone forward, as a lot of people did. There was a guy from South Jersey who was that way, Herm, short guy, dark hair.
Marty Herman.
Marty Herman is another one of those.
Bill Hamilton.
Oh, Prince, one of the best.
Steve Persky.
Yeah, another one. Absolutely.
John
Understood politics. They all understand politics. They all can play as hard a game as anybody. But when push came to shove, they would always make a decision that they thought was, if the public had a problem, they would solve that problem one way or the other.
John Paul Doyle and John Russo.
Both the same. Very good politicians, both of them, that I fenced with significantly, particularly Russo.
One more time. Why is this quality lost? You say it's because the county chairman and the leadership PACs now funnel the money to the candidates instead of them raising it on their own? Is that why?
We fought so hard to get independence, to get, during that era of the 70s and the early 80s, and even after I was in the council's office, they continued to fight for that independent power of the legislature to make its own judgments. And they were able to do that without being influenced or affected by the political bosses. Tom Kean was able to do it because he was never supported by the county organizations. That's while he was as a legislator and while he was governor. We understood that in the governor's office, and there's no question that the Alan Karchers of the world or the Chris Jackmans of the world or the other legislators are getting independently elected on their own ability as politicians in their district, with some exceptions, which I've noted, and that represents the majority of the legislature. So they're there on their own standing, not because someone else got them there. Today, they're there because they're picked by an organization who raises the money for them, not because they're there on their own standing.
So the bosses are really more powerful today than they
Ever were
in the 70s.
in the 70s. The bosses in the 70s, most of them were legislators. They were senators. The people who ran the county organizations were the senator from that county because they had control of patronage and senatorial courtesy. So at least they were elected during that period. And you had some great legislators back then. The Al Beatlestons of the world, and there were some great legislators in the 50s and 60s. I don't see that today. I really don't. And I don't see it because I think too many of them have to answer to too many sources outside of the electorate as to why they're there. No, not all of them. Some of them are power brokers on their own. Sweeney is a power broker on his own. That's a different, but he's not the majority there. He's the minority. The independence of the legislators were the majority. I had the ability to stand up and say, I'm going to vote for NJ Transit. I'm going to vote for the Pinelands. I'm going to support the Pinelands. I had Jim Hurley, who was our leader at the time, from South Jersey, absolutely killing people if you supported the Pinelands. But we had the ability to do that. We could stand up because no one could affect my election except me and my district and how well I ran my world. There was no outside force that could take me out, literally. And for the majority of the legislators during the late 70s and 80s, that was the case.
How are we doing on tape back there?
90 minutes. You want to take a break?
No, I'm
We
fine.
haven't gotten the cane yet.
Right.
We've tangentially gotten
Yes.
to it. Were you surprised at Brendan Burns' problems with his own party on tax votes?
In the first term?
Yes.
No.
Why not?
Because the positions he took were the right ones, fundamentally, as I told you, on the income tax issue. And he had a reputation for being cantankerously independent anyway. He understood politics, particularly Essex County politics, I think, but he was one of those people who was not going to compromise the public interest for a political position or for his own political expediency. He just wouldn't do it. And it really didn't matter. Tom Kean had the same standing, personally. They weren't going to compromise what they believed was the right thing for the public of New Jersey for political well-being. They may compromise it themselves on their own basis, but they're not going to do it because of pressures from the outside. Let me change that. They may parcel out their political currency. You earn political currency, standing. Brendan pushed his to a limit on the income tax. And it was Jimmy Dugan and the Democratic organization that was making him one-term burn and saw the ability to knock him out and maybe take control. That was a political move at the expense of the public of the state. And Brendan said, no, I'm not going to do that.
When you look back at that fight,
I was on the outside looking in then.
okay, when you look back upon it, did Byrne make mistakes?
Yeah, a lot of practical, logistical mistakes. New governor, learning the power of the governor, how to exercise it. The legislators, Jimmy Dugan and some of those guys, were much more experienced. Brendan had been a prosecutor, a judge. In fact, I appeared for him 2 weeks before he became governor. He decided to run for governor on a case in Morris County. And he understood Essex politics, but he didn't understand legislative politics. And I think Brendan spent his first 4 years getting beat up by people who did understand legislative politics, and he didn't. Very smart, brilliant man, Brendan, in my opinion. Was going to do what was right, and he ultimately would fight for what was right.
Does that mean the governor's going to be more successful if he comes out of the legislature than if he comes from outside?
He doesn't have to come out of it, but he sure has to understand it. However he gets that understanding is not material. If it's having been there, that's a value. Tom Kean, having been a legislator, in dealing with the Democratic legislature for the 4 years we were there in the first term, and myself having been there, was invaluable in the process.
What did you think about the general range of policy initiatives that Byrne brought with him?
I would disagree with him on a lot of his labor policies. I thought the Byrne administration gave away too much, as Democrats do, to organize labor as a constituency. I think they've hurt the state as a result of that. I don't think they believe that, but I think they have.
What did they give labor?
Too high an economic standing in this state. It costs too much to build. It costs too much for jobs. That's an ongoing debate that they can make a very good argument on the other side of that, but I disagree with it from a policy perspective. But basically his policies, I think, were sound. Brendan was looking to do the right thing, felt very empowered in the second term to do, when I was there with him, to do what he thought was the right thing for the state of New Jersey. And he was not going to be bowed or pushed around by the political structure. That was the NJ Transit example, is a good one. Pinelands. NJ Transit, Pinelands, maybe, and the income tax probably his greatest legacies. But there's a lot more smaller ones in there.
Casino gambling is one.
Yes.
Where were you on that?
I was a supporter of it. Tom was against it, which was an interesting phenomenon. Tom never liked casino gaming and tolerated it during his 8 years that he was there, but never did much more than that. I think Brendan saw it as a resource for the state and one worth doing.
Were there party positions on the issue? Was
Not
it a
that
Democratic?
By the time I got there, it had passed. It was there. The question was, how are we going to manage it? Were we going to keep it free of organized crime? Brendan oversaw the drafting of the toughest and best casino gaming law in the country that's ever been written, and kept organized crime out of it. So an incredible amount of credit goes to him for having done it and fought for that legislation. I know the lawyers that drafted that, the Al Lucianis and the Browns of this world, who put that package together. And they succeeded and did just a terrific job.
What did you think of Brendan as a politician?
He's a great politician after his first term. It was that lack of experience in dealing in the legislature that I think he learned a lot. And he's a very smart man and learned his lessons well. And I think he's become one of the premier politicians in the state of New Jersey. He is. He and Tom Kean, I believe, are the two best politicians the state's produced outside of Dick Hughes, who was just naturally the best I've ever seen.
Did his top lieutenants, Dick Leone and Lou Caden, work well with the legislature, or did they antagonize the legislature?
They fought with the legislature. They fought for economic responsibility. That a legislature as a group, individuals and legislators as a group, tend not to take as seriously as they should. It's one of where the checks and balance really work. If you have a strong financial people, and Dick Leone and Caden represented that during a very difficult period and gave integrity to the state's financial standing by fighting the legislature's natural tendency not to care about that issue. So it's one of those places where the executive's power and the check and balance and having a solid treasurer in place was brilliant. And he had two of the best maybe we've ever had in the state. And we needed them then because of the issues that were at hand.
What's that word?
It's commission.
Commission. Was it a mistake not to have a commission like the Meadowlands Commission, is that what you mean, for Atlantic City development?
Yeah, yes. The Atlantic City is and has been marginally capable or incapable of representing itself and running the city because of gaming being there. There should have been an alternative, whether it was a commission or a conservatorship that was put in place, or Atlantic City was made a part of a bigger entity, because there was no one left to run Atlantic City who wasn't barred with talent from actually running it. That's small cities. It only had 48,000 people when we started, 30 or 28 to 30,000 after casino gaming came in. And anybody that had any talent was working for the casinos and barred from politics. I think cities that lack that talent, Camden's another city that comes to mind, where the same, for different dynamics, the same thing happens. The inability in New Jersey to have a commission or a conservatorship system for those local governments was a mistake. It was the missing ingredient in the Casino Act. I think Brendan would probably admit that today. Tom Kane, when Mike Matthews got indicted, had an opportunity perhaps to have stepped in and tried to pass a legislation or do something about putting a conservatorship or a commission to run Atlantic City. It was the political time when it could have been done, and he just wasn't about to spend his political capital on that issue at the time.
Looking back, has the Meadowlands been a success or
Absolutely.
a failure?
Absolutely.
How so?
I think it's been a success. There was no way you could have managed those 13 towns with those kind of environmental problems without having put it together, the Meadowlands Commission. It serves as a model in certain circumstances that we followed it significantly when they did Pinelands. Same kind of concept. But we never could have protected what we have protected in the Meadowlands without that commission having been put together. And I think history will, you can find fault with it, things they did wrong, allowed some areas to get overdeveloped maybe, but on balance, I think the Meadowlands Commission was an absolute success.
Sports Authority?
Sports Authority was also a screaming success for the state, notwithstanding the fact that it loses some dollars. Its economic impact in New Jersey is immeasurable, absolutely immeasurable.
Because of pro sports teams?
Well, the whole racing, every step it's made. It made New Jersey, it put New Jersey, North Jersey, as an entertainment and sports venue on the map nationally. And that never would have happened without the Sports Authority being there. The racing, the Meadowlands racetrack kept our horse industry alive longer than it should have been, could have stood on its own merit without the size of that particular track. And the fact that it ran its course economically and maybe needed some support from state government was minuscule compared to the benefits, I think, that the states received.
How did you feel back then, and how do you feel today about a greater state role in land use planning?
Oh, that's one of my pet issues. I put the State Planning Act together very carefully by eliminating state planning and the DCA and creating a void to pass the State Planning Act, including trying to do legislation on fair housing, COA, that we didn't do as well as we could have. But the State Planning Commission and the State Planning Act was the next logical growth from the Municipal Planning Act. And it needs to take, and has needed for about a dozen years, to take the next step. Through New Jersey Futures, I've kept working on that area and smart growth, because I've been on the board of New Jersey Futures since it started.
What is the next step that it needs to take?
A more profound role in implementing, where the local planning becomes an input into state planning, so that we protect the natural environment that we have and promote real growth and development, smart growth that we've promoted through New Jersey Future. With a stronger State Planning Act, would have implemented smart growth already and and given incredible economic development opportunity for development in areas where development should take place and can. Developers don't care where they make their money. They want it the easiest and the simplest and the cheapest. If we put together a system, and we can do that through state planning, that allows them to regentrify and regrow old areas so that they can make a profit, which they're allowed to make, we won't be dealing with sprawl and wiping out our farmlands and our natural resources and our open spaces, which we have far too few of in the state. And so the next step in state planning that hasn't happened should have happened 10 or 12 years ago. And it should have encompassed things like the incentives to make smart growth the byword and the development focus in this state. And developers can make money. We can have better housing for people, better, more planned development where the infrastructure exists. We can upgrade that infrastructure. We'll have the dollars to upgrade our sewage treatment plants and all of our support in areas where 80% of it's already built. We only have to take it the next 20 or fix it. We don't have to recreate it in Warren County or in Cape May. We can do it where it exists. And state planning allows us to do that. That's controlled with local governments and local planning so they don't lose their capacity to design their own neighborhoods. They can still design their own neighborhoods and still do it. And somebody taking that mantle and running with it is the kind of thing that's been missing in politics and the legislature for a very, very long time, last 10, 12 years.
We're going to take a break. When we resume, let's talk about you and the Kane campaign of 1981.
Okay.
That's perhaps a difference between the legislature of your era when you were a legislator and the legislature as we know it today. Mm-hmm. It's more staff-driven. There's more staff today than there was in your day. What's the consequence of that, if any?
Well, going back to my years, we fought for more staff. I remember that we didn't have a place to hang our coat. I lost 2 trench coats in my first 4 years, so I didn't have a place to hang my jacket except over the back of my chair in the legislature. Our desk was really our desk. We had no offices even. We didn't have staff. We had some stamps, and we just started hiring staff in the late 70s, early 80s. Staff has gone through the ceiling since then. Now, a lot of that was directly related to the effort of those legislators in the 70s and 80s who fought for the independence of the legislature from the governor. Because prior to that, 1968, the Hughes era, even Cahill and Minor, the governors used to dictate the agenda for the legislature. They give a list of bills they wanted to pass. And the legislators fought for that era to become independent. When they did that, they fought for independent staff at the same time. They did another thing. They separated themselves. As they got staff, they got offices. So we didn't have to hang our coats over anymore. Each legislator has a bank of offices now in the State House that they occupy, and their staff between them and the public. You used to be able to walk in between the Senate and the Assembly, between the red and green lights that were hanging in the hallway. The press corps was down the middle, and you were there, and that's the only place you could be as a legislator. There was nothing buffering you from either the public that wanted to come lobby you on a bill, or the media, print media or electronic, that wanted, or lobbyists that wanted to get your opinion. Now, there's staff between the legislators and all of those people. And staff does research for them, and they run their legislative offices, and they deal with their constituent work. That is a good thing on the one side because they have more data available. They have more research available. They know more and can know more about a bill and legislation. Their lack of accountability, however, has diminished and gone the opposite way, despite the passage of Oprah, which we also talked about a little bit. So now the staff and the separation and the limitations on the media's ability to watch legislators has taken accountability significantly off the table. And it's a combination of all of those things that have, I think, hurt the legislators' accountability back to their constituents and the knowledge of their constituents about what's really going on, as opposed to what staff produces for them and their campaigns spin for them back to their districts. So the public is not getting the information that they need to as a result of it. So that's what I think is the big downside of that. Staffing is only a part of that. There's a much more, a much greater dynamic happening, which has to do both with media, staff, and physical availability of legislators in the system to their constituencies. They only go when they want to go. They used to not be able to avoid going.
They don't have to go to every rubber chicken event in their districts anymore?
It's the ones they want to, the ones they choose to. And on information delivered to the constituents that they choose, because they have the dollars to deliver that back to them, but they spin it their way. Who's spinning it the other way? No one, and particularly in today's world. So they have staff to spin it for them, design it for them, so it looks good, both partisan staff and nonpartisan staff, and they have a reduction in the capacity of media to hold them accountable, either local media or the statewide press corps, on it from a policy perspective. And we created that. I mean, our era, in the 70s and 80s, the fight for legislators to get independence as a separate branch of government kind of created that. But we lost another check and balance on the other side.
Let's turn our focus to the 81 gubernatorial race.
Mm-hmm.
Set the table for us. Say in 1979, staring forward, there's a two-term governor who's about to leave. That's a big vacuum in New Jersey politics when a governor's seat is vacant. Who all looks like they might want it?
Pat Kramer probably started campaigning 1979, 1980, and positioning himself for the governor's race. Tom Kean was on NJN, staying away and above the fray in many ways. There was a system that existed then in which the county chairman could control the line for the 21 counties. And Tom was looking at walking down the same road he had walked down in 77, where he could not control enough counties and enough organizations, nor was he willing to make the compromises necessary to do that. He wouldn't compromise his own principles to do that. So we as a Republican Party had no money because we controlled neither the governor's office nor the legislature. We couldn't raise money. The Democrats could raise money in that world, legislatively and from an executive perspective. The only thing we thought we had going for us was the Democrats couldn't focus on a candidate. There was a lot of debate going on within the Democratic organization as to who the gubernatorial candidate might be. So their internal fight was giving us opportunity. And it turned out to be that debate and that fight that gave us the real opportunity to give Tom Kean an opportunity to win, which is that open primary vote. Jim Florio had positioned himself well within the organizational structure. There was a couple of other candidates that were interested in running, but Brendan and the administration was interested in supporting John Degnan and what John stood for. And we made that arrangement, that political arrangement for putting all the statewide candidates in one column, short-circuited. This happened like in April.
Of 81?
Of 81, just before the election. Pat Kramer had raised a lot of money and had garnered, I think, 18 county chairmen. He was hell-bent to Sunday to grab that primary election, and all of a sudden, there was no column for him, and their support and the only thing he had gotten was their support, so there was no campaign to back up that support. No longer existed.
He must have been livid.
I think he was, from everything I know. Bo Sullivan jumped in the race during that particular period. because he thought, and he actually turned out did well or better than Pat Kramer did. I think it was the beer in Hoboken that made that, or something along those lines. But without that open primary act, there's no question that Tom Kean would not have been competitive in that '81 election. And it was the Democrats, I think, and people may disagree, but their debate over who was going to be their candidate, was going to be Jim Florio, John Degnan, or other individuals who were filing and or thinking of becoming governor. One thing we say about legislators all the time, particularly during that era in the 70s and 80s, every time they woke up and looked in the mirror, they saw, in the morning, they saw a governor looking back at them. So they all felt they could be governor, and a lot of them could. So there was a lot of interest in that world.
There were so many candidates in the two-party primaries that year that at New Jersey Monthly, where I was the editor at the time, we put their faces on little sardines and put a big can on the cover. And there were 18 sardines lined up inside with different faces on them.
That's right.
I think 10 or 11 of them were Democrats and maybe 6 or 7 were Republicans.
Yes.
Who were the key Kean advisors leading up to '81?
Good question. Tom had, has always had, his own, he kept his own councils with a wide range of people. And Tom had a wide range of business people, constituents, and constituent groups that he had been associated with most of his life. And was a great planner and communicator and decider of his own image. His family history and economic standing was part of that. He believed, I think, that he was the best manager of his own image. And very often had a wide range of people that he communicated with, and he had some key people, friends, family members, that he would call on to assist him, the Tony Ciccatellas of the world, who were friends, to help him in that communication world. I kept in touch with him separately. He kept in touch with Barrett, like a Bill Gormley, for instance, who was also a big supporter. Dr. Lane was another big supporter. There were people in the business community, and in various constituencies throughout the state. The Jewish community, the African American community, which were Tom's friends for a lifetime that he would call on to get advice from as to how he stood. It's why I think he was so responsive to substance versus just the raw politics. But he liked the politics. He could also stir the pot as well as anybody in the process. So he understood the politics, but just was never willing to make that compromise of his principles to do that.
Did there emerge a key political strategist, a la Karl Rove or Steve D'Amico on the Democratic side today, or?
No, it was Tom Kean, and it was a group of people. Whether it was the Roger Bodmans, who were young at the time, the Tony Ciccatellas, the Ken Merents and myself, who were writing issues during that campaign, whether it was the Nancy Beckers, lobbyists that he had known for years that he counted on, constituent groups. But Tom, very strangely, was really managing it all himself through various friends and people that he trusted and liked.
Was he gubernatorial in those days? Did he project that kind of...
As gubernatorial as anyone who's not been governor. More gubernatorial than many who have not been governor today. Yes, he was much more aware of the constituencies of the state, of who they were, and his own image. Carl Golden, I think, was, if there was anyone who had probably the single most profound effect, Carl's ability to communicate succinctly what Tom's position was with the print media, which was far more dominant during that period, probably was the biggest asset Tom had going for him, both in the campaign and while he was governor. Carl was just unique in his skill to be able to do that. And Tom depended on Carl very heavily to take what, for me, if I responded, might be a very verbose, as I'm clearly noted to be. What would the press corps say? They ask me what time it is, I'll tell them how to build a clock. That's not the answer you want. Carl knew the answer. And he knew how to take something and shrink it down.
Did Carl go way back with Kane?
Yes, back to the
Speaker?
legislature, Speaker. Carl was the spokesman for the Assembly, I think, when Tom was gave up his leadership role to run in -- and Carl is a incredibly uniquely talented person in that capacity, to cut through and get the quotable quote there. And he could take Tom and give him that quotable quote in most instances.
What was Kane's strength as a prospective governor, or as this prospective candidate for governor? What was his strength?
Different than as a governor. The image that he had created, and the image that was an accurate one of him, was one who was substantively driven, would not compromise, economically could not be bought because he had the economic, personally would not compromise his principles. That, by comparison to Jim Florio, I tell a story very often. I would go out with Tom periodically during the campaign in '81. And I remember going to the Hospital Association. And the Hospital Association is right down here in Princeton. They have this big headquarters and a huge auditorium. And they fill that place, maybe with 500, 1,000 people. And that was one of our stops. Tom never arrived at a stop on time because he spent too much time talking to everybody at the previous stop that he knew. And he would take the time to do that. If you're a media person and you stopped him and asked him a question, he'd stop, he'd answer you, look you right in the eye and answer it. And he did it for everybody. Everybody. We walked into the Princeton headquarters for the Hospital Association. 1,000 people in this big auditorium. Tom had to go give a speech. He walked in the front door. It took us 45 minutes to get from the front door to the podium. He got off the podium. It took another 45 minutes to get him off the podium, out the front door again, and he sidetracked into a meeting with a constituent group that wanted to talk to him. None of which was on a schedule. This was a 10-minute, 15-minute stop. And he answered every question every media person ever asked him in the entire campaign. Jim Florio, who had been at the same place 2 hours earlier, came in the back door, saw no one, went to the podium, made his speech, went right back out the back door, answered no questions.
Is that why Tom Kane won the election?
That's why he won the election. There's no question. The general election, that's why he won. Jim was aloof, separate, very committed guy, Jim Florio, to public policy, really believed, but just had no interpersonal capacity to react. Tom knew that was the right thing to do. He needed to communicate. And he was managing his own campaign in reality. And that's what Tom did. It's the only way I can explain it. And the contrast, though, is what's important. You got Jim Florio, the boxer, the hard guy, hard charging, on time, on schedule, only talks when he needs to, introverted to some degree. And Tom Kane, his wrinkled suit, this huggy-buggy, talk to anybody. People identified with him, even though he was from a different economic class. It was amazing. And Tom had learned that over 15 or 20 years of politics, that he had to be that way in order not to alienate the world that he was trying to represent. And I think his father taught him that, frankly.
His father had been a congressman.
A very successful one, a very popular one. And he was, he never wanted his economic standing to get in the way. And he fought that, both in his appearance and his availability all the time. You never found Tom saying he wouldn't talk to you.
That's interesting that to narrow the gap between his background and the average person's background required the spending of time and the laying on of hands.
Exactly. And he understood that. He understood the importance of that.
What was his biggest liability as a campaigner?
That same problem. When you get to be governor, I guess the biggest problem when he actually got there was to let go of his own image. And I think if Greg Stevens were around today, he would probably tell you, and Carl might, and Bob Grady might, who helped manage that image of his, that he couldn't manage his own image as governor. Convincing him of that was, during the first 6 months or a year, was toil and trouble, I want to tell you, because he wanted to make his own decisions about his scheduling, where he went, what he did. And you just can't do that as governor. And convincing him to do that was a very difficult, and to let go. If he hadn't had a lot of faith in Carl Golden on the print media side, on Bob Grady on his speech writing and the writing piece, me in the legislature, I guess, and Greg Stevens coming on as chief of staff, I think Greg was the final piece that finally let him let go of that, and allow him to use his time and his energies to focus on policy and the decisions he had to make, and the decisions he had to make that were important. You can never, at that level, governors, presidents, completely trust all the advice you get. So Tom was able then to use his time to focus on decisions he had to make, and he would reach out to all those people, and he'd ask their opinion. I wanted to be sure that he had, from the council's position on every public policy issue, everybody's opinion. Not just mine, but the assistant councils, the lobbyists, the constituent groups, the legislator who supported the bill, the department, the division of the department. We gave him a mass of data that he absorbed and made decisions with. And we thought that was absolutely vital. I got criticized, I remember back when we first started the administration. I had all my assistant councils go to the State House Annex, and we invited all the lobbyists in the state to come in. And we introduced each one. So this one's in charge of DEP. This one's in charge of DCA. If you have a problem, we want to know what your opinion is. We may not agree with you, but we want to hear it. It's very important. And ultimately, it's going to be very important for the governor. And the governor will see your opinion. And he did. We wrote these massive memos to him. And I would always add my comments at the end in writing. But he had everybody's opinion, honestly. And my councils and assistant councils were directed to do that. I think that's what he got from all of his sources. And so he was able to focus then on running government as governor and not having to worry about creating his own image anymore, which he couldn't do. It's just too massive a job. And when he let go of it, it got better. Government got better, therefore his image got better. It was like a snowball, just moving forward.
Let's stop there for now. When we resume, let's go back to the '81 campaign and talk about some of the highlights of that campaign.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
Hour left on this tape.
Okay.
So you want to break in the middle, or you want to go straight?
He can do an hour, I can tell.
Okay.
Unless if you feel you want to break, you just say so.
I'll say so, sure.
Yeah.
whatever.
Cary, looking back at the 1981 campaign for governor, what memories come into your mind? What was a highlight of that campaign?
Well, I told you one of the stories, the contrast between Tom and Florio at the Hospital Association. I found that to be a seminal kind of moment for me, at least in understanding that I believe Tom could win that election. Because I really understood the difference between Tom and Florio at that point. And I had heard all those anecdotal stories, but I never really watched him do that, because I would only go out with him once every 2 or 3 weeks. I'd be back. I had my own campaign. I was also involved in running the legislative campaign with Dean. I was Dean's assistant and running for the Republican group. And I was back in the office working with Ken on memos and position papers and things like that.
Where was the office?
It was in Union on Route 22, on Morris Avenue, excuse me.
How often would you go there?
Well, it depends on when. During the recount, I was there every day for 4 weeks. I slept there almost. But prior to that, I'd go there once, twice a week, 3 times a week. I'd meet Ken. We'd go over position papers. I'd listen to everybody's complaint about all the problems in the campaign and who's getting slighted and who was annoyed at who and And everybody was always annoyed at somebody, which is about what campaigns are really about. And so all that scuttlebutt would be gone. They were also handing the Treasury stuff out of there. So if I needed funds for our legislative candidates that were handling those accounts, I would have to go see the individual who was doing that. So I was in and out of that headquarters a lot.
Do you recall a position or an issue that may have been controversial within the campaign, or that was tricky to navigate?
Well, they were all tricky to navigate with reference to and maintain credibility, because credibility was always important to Tom in his positions. If he had one kind of theme that he kept pounding at Ken and me, or that we would get, was the credibility of the statement. He didn't want us ducking issues and being obvious about it, I guess. It's not really, that's a really inaccurate way of describing it. He wanted us to be honest about our positions. And he would rather not say anything if he couldn't say what he wanted to say that was accurate in the statements. And the positions were designed to deal with the kind of the issues of the moment. I'm trying to remember any I don't remember any that were really seminal. The campaign was much more personality than it was the contrast. That's what I meant about that appearance before the Hospital Association. I saw that repeated a half a dozen times after that. And I came to learn that it was as much Tom's credibility on issues as the positions he took. So we worked very hard, Ken and I did, and Ken really did all the work. I just kind of added the contemporary knowledge of the existing legislative and state positions about issues that Ken didn't understand. But being credible was more important than the actual position. In other words, giving Tom's honest opinion and being perceived as being honest. You didn't want the Hospital Association to say, well, that's not what you said last week, on this issue. And being consistent was as important as any one position. And I don't remember the campaign being dominated by issues. They were much more dominated, as it turned out, by the personalities of Jim Florio and his governance capacity, and Tom Cannon, his governance capacity.
What, in your memory, and I realize that 27 years can probably blur this sort of thing, but what was Tom Kean offering New Jersey? What was the fundamental message of Kean back then?
Honesty, credibility, integrity, can't be bought. A new view of the state, a different view. You have to remember, Republicans had not been there except for the 4 years of Florio. Out of 28 years, it was 4 years of Cahill, and the legislature for the last 10 or 12 years have been dominated by the Democrats. And it was time to get a new, fresh look at where New Jersey was going, particularly its economy and its business climate, which was a very important issue from our perspective. And Tom particularly was more capable as a businessman in dealing with and focusing on our economy and our future. If you remember, there was a 21% were the interest rates. Inflation was being fought by Reagan at that point at incredible numbers. Our unemployment figures were going down. So there was kind of an economy twist to where we were going, and a new look at how New Jersey's government and business married and worked with each other.
Do you recall whether Florio and Kean took tax positions that differed in any way?
I don't recall. I really don't.
In '81, Byrne had lost a lot of his popularity. His name had gone up on the arena. People were maybe a little tired of Brendan Byrne. Do you recall whether Kean exploited some of that anti-Byrne sentiment?
Well, Byrne was cantankerously independent because he had won that election and moved in ways. A lot of them were very good for New Jersey. We pointed them out, NJ Transit, Pinelands, some really great things, I think, that have been good for the state. But Brendan also was cantankerously independent personally. And yeah, I like my name on the arena. and things of that nature, which did alienate him to some degree. And yes, I think we did capitalize on that. Particularly the arena issue, I think was something that Tom pointed out that he would never do. And I think he was very critical of the Byrne administration's focus or lack of focus on employment, jobs, and the economy. Were big issues that Tom felt he was more capable, and Republicans were more capable of, in fact, dealing with.
You told us off camera that there were debates and that you played Florio in the debate, in a mock debate?
Yes. There was a debate with Jim Florio that was scheduled. Staff wanted to put together and make Tom come in and actually debate somebody and go through the mechanics of that, which he didn't want to do. But he was doing it because we all made him do it, I guess. And I was charged with the responsibility of being Jim Florio in that scenario.
Why you?
Because I was probably the most up-to-date on issues and the issues facing, and could challenge Tom more directly on issues than anyone else could, because I knew more about the issues of the moment, because I was helped writing them, and etc. I think that was the primary reason. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a bad debater, I think, in the final analysis. And Tom shows up, and he's got a wrinkled green, bright green blazer on. He's got a checkered shirt, a tie that doesn't match it, a beaded belt, and plaid pants. I mean, he was a sight for sore eyes, is all I can say. And it was just his kind of, he had a kind of a warped sense of humor sometimes. And it was his way of saying, I don't want to be here, and I don't want to do this. But I'm here because you all think I should be here, and we'll go through that scenario.
How was he as a debater?
Very good. He really was good. I did know the issues, and I knew them in much greater depth than he did. But he parried and handled them very well. And maybe I had a level of intensity that Florio might have brought to the scene too, that helped add to that. I tried to add intensity to my presentation to do that, because I had recognized, and Tom handled it just like he did, very, very carefully but very humanly, and absolutely showed that contrast. I think ultimately he did that in the debates also.
It's remembered by some that Kane used to express pride in New Jersey.
Yes.
To what extent might that have been an issue in that campaign?
The pride in New Jersey goes to, I think, a real pride that Tom has in the state, that and he did capitalize on this, now that you bring that up, on people's opinion that New Jersey is more than the New Jersey Turnpike, and the jokes you hear. And they were very prevalent back then. It wasn't smokestacks and oil refineries on the Turnpike, that there was Cape May and High Point that you had to see, that this was a great state. That ultimately was reflected in the New Jersey and You Perfect Together theme that came out, which was, it was really, that was the theme that Tom produced and chose as the options that were given to him for promoting New Jersey in a very broad sense. But he really believed that. And he was always a promoter of New Jersey as a different place in people's opinion of it was. And he thought our economy, we were, people used to say New Jersey like an untapped, it was like a keg tapped at both ends, Philadelphia and New York, so nobody knows who we are. Tom wanted him to know who we were, because what New Jersey is really a wonderful place to live, raise your family, great educational system, and its economy needed fixing. And our unemployment rate was too high. So that was the focus that he had during the campaign, and you saw that reflected later on in the implementation of the New Jersey and You Perfect Together.
As we all know, Tom Kane speaks with an accent born of prep school in Massachusetts, and who knows what else exactly, but it's pretty unique.
It is unique.
Was there any effort to change that, to make him more plain speaking?
No, the opposite. I think that was part of Tom's hominess, and that was not, as I understand it and know it, that was not an accent from Massachusetts. That was a speech habit that Tom had developed in life that had nothing to do with Massachusetts or prep schools, or that's just his way of speaking.
Did his father speak that way?
No, not at all. That was, it was, I don't want to say it's a speech impediment, but it was his way of speaking. And it was developed in his youth as he grew up.
And he did stutter in his youth. I
Yes, he
remember
did.
he told
That
me.
was part of it, yes. And it was his way of correcting that stuttering.
Do you know if he got professional training
No, I don't.
in New York?
I don't know. But I know he handled it very well, and we liked it. I mean, we thought that was a uniqueness about him. There was a very homey uniqueness. And
You weren't worried that it was sounding blue blood and over the heads
Nope.
of the average
Nope.
person?
And it didn't turn out to be that way. We thought it reflected what the real Tom Kane was. And if he changed it, it would have looked artificial. And Tom's own image of him and that he wanted was an honest one. He wanted people to try to really see his substance and not the accoutrements that were around him, either speech, money, clothes. It was the substance he was trying to get through with that he believed he had.
The clothes, you just commented upon his wardrobe the day of the mock debate, but that was purposeful, I gather.
That was purposeful, very purposeful. That was mocking us in reality for dragging him into this.
Was he sartorially splendid? Was he, what was his style?
Couldn't care less about his clothes. There was a joke in the family, I guess, that people used to talk about that when the Canes went out and bought clothes for the family, they'd give them to all the brothers and they'd hand them down to Tom. And Tom didn't want any new clothes. He just couldn't care less about that. And I think he thought it was important that he didn't care about those accoutrements of life. That because of his family and his background, which he was very proud of, and their public service, it was very important that people got him for his substance. And if he addressed that in any way with sharper clothes or a better look, that would take away from the substance of what he was trying to say. And in a bad way, not in a good way.
Do you recall what your polls were saying as the election drew near?
The polls always had us running a little behind, always. But some of our own polls showed that difference in likability, I think, and this is what I got, between Tom Kane and Jim Florio. And the likability, we thought, was not insignificant. But I was not part of that polling group that studied every poll that came in. I only got data about issues sometimes if they happened to be of some concern, which very rarely were. Polling in campaigns is not designed to tell you who's winning or who's losing. It's designed to tell you what the public is listening to be sure that you're plugged into what they're listening to. So the polling has a different real value than most media people or the public see it for candidates. I understood that a little bit, but I really understood it later on when I ran myself, about how important those polls were for reasons other than what you look at them.
It doesn't tell you whether you're winning or losing?
It doesn't really, no. It does have those numbers attached to it, but it tells you whether your message is getting across, what your message should be, how you can change your message if you need to, in order to get it across better based on what people were listening to. It tells you your delivery, the amount of media that you buy. Did it have an impact or didn't it have an impact? Was the message right in that impact? And that's what the polling really was about. That's what the Roger Bodmans and Tom and the professionals that were looking at it, people from the RNC, were looking at to try to help him mold his message and his speech message.
Who managed the campaign?
Tom did. Now, he wouldn't admit that, I don't think, but and everybody else was trying to manage him. And the game with Tom always was, everybody's trying to manage him, and he lets everybody think they're managing a little bit, and never contradicts them. But he was managing that campaign in reality. That's what I got in hindsight. Not only hindsight then, which I believed when the campaign was over, that he was really doing it, but I believed him more when I got to the governor's office and we were trying to manage him when he didn't want to be managed. And he was acting just like he did in the campaign until he finally realized that he needed people to help him manage his life as governor because it was too big for him to do himself.
Were there any key constituency groups that you were going after?
Tom was trying to get across. He was known as a moderate to liberal Republican, and the fight was for him to get through to the conservative side of the Republican Party. That he had a physical conservative part of him that was dominant on the economic side. He never said it was on the social side, but he argued very hard to help be identified particularly in the primary time, but even afterwards, that there was a conservativeness to him on the fiscal side, and that was the difference between him and Jim Florio.
In your recollection, was there a key county or counties in
the campaign?
The campaign?
They were all key. We had won by 1,797 votes when they finally tallied the votes about 2 or 3 days after the election. And we didn't know that till 2 or 3 days after the election. The numbers that the polls were showing were all over the place. And Tom was just playing, or trying to play, to the constituencies of New Jersey in a very broad sense. I don't know that he was focusing on a county or a specific level. Tom had the capacity, because of his experience in Essex, his background with constituencies on social issues, to attract greater minority votes, Jewish votes, African American votes, because he had been a champion and a friend of theirs for a long time. So I think he was trying to put dents with his social policies and positions in those constituencies, and play very heavily in the campaign on the fiscal side to attract a broader audience.
You say he had to appeal to conservatives. In the primary, were there any litmus test issues like abortion or gun rights that he had difficulty navigating?
No, he navigated most of those successfully. He just kept playing the physical conservative side of that. But you have to remember, Democrats out-registered Republicans by about 30%. So somehow, if you're going to win an election in New Jersey, you have to get into a more moderate and liberal constituency. A moderate constituency is what I'll call it. And Tom was well known among many of the minority constituencies in New Jersey, and I think did well in them. It's not that he got more than 50% of, let's say, the African American vote, but instead of losing 90%, he lost 75% of it. He was popular in the Jewish community because of his father's stand on the Holocaust and a history that is inescapable. Those kinds of things were also being very subtly communicated through constituencies across the state.
Had he...
Because he had to get into, and this is hindsight looking back at it, more than my active participation in it, because I was just doing issues. He had to cut into that constituency to beat a Democrat in New Jersey.
Do you think he had formed the notion, the politics of inclusion yet at that point in his development?
I think without using that phrase, I think he always believed in the politics of inclusion. And he was communicating it in different ways. And the campaign was attempting to do that. He had a not insignificant moderate and democratic level of support. And it was kind of a subtlety running around under the campaign, while the message was always economic and New Jersey and as I remember it, and other things. If you go back now and then look at his re-election 4 years later, and look at the vote levels in the minority communities, they're off the charts. I mean, no Republican anywhere in the country has ever come close to that. Because it's naturally his constituencies. It's ones that have been him and his families forever. And it's not something you can trump up, if you follow what I mean. So, and he handled that. That's why I think he managed his own campaign very well. Because nobody else could do that but him.
Nonetheless, I'm sure he had paid campaign consultants.
Yes, he did.
Who were they? Do you recall?
Roger Stone, I think, was involved, if I remember correctly. I'm trying to remember who the pollster was that he was using. But yes, he had paid consultants that he was depending on.
Was he paying Roger Bodman his campaign
Yes,
manager?
Roger was being paid. Alpha Sola was another. Al was running some of the finances, and Roger was doing a great deal of managing as a young guy, a very, very aggressive and dynamic job. Alienating staff people all the time and annoying people, but necessarily it's a tough job. Somebody's got to sit on people's heads and make them, toe the line.
How about you? Were you a paid
No,
consultant?
no. I was strictly a volunteer.
Do you remember election night?
Oh, yes, I remember election night.
Where were you?
Headquarters was in Livingston at the Holiday Inn. I was there until 8 o'clock. Now, I was running for election myself. So I had to run back to my district, and I had a victory party. My district just didn't lose, Republican. It wasn't a difficult election, but a lot of people had worked very hard, and I wasn't spending a lot of time in the district. I was spending a lot of time on legislative candidates and on Tom's campaign. So I went back to my district, went to the party. 10 o'clock I went home, changed my suit, 10:30. Got back to the Holiday Inn around 11:30, 12 o'clock. No decision had been made. They were all huddled up, and the telephone calls were being made to the AG's office, and Erwin Kimmelman was there, I was there, Roger, Bodman, and that whole crew. Hearst Kozlov was there. He was counsel to the Republican Party at the time, and Erwin just made a call to the Supreme Court to get an order locking the machines up. I found out subsequently, today as a matter of fact, that Brendan had already called and locked up the machines and had the state police do that at about 10 o'clock, which was a very important...
Anticipating the need for a recount?
No, the need for anybody stealing votes, for monkeying with machines, being sure that it was an honest election, and to guarantee it, because we had no votes in from Camden, Hudson yet. They were holding their votes back. There was all kinds of conspiracy theories out there that only magnified themselves over the next 2 or 3 days till a final number came out. Then we got into the recount.
Who demanded the recount? Do you recall?
We did. And then Florio did. We did before we even knew what the results were, because we were convinced it was going to get stolen from us in one of the counties. And then Florio, after having lost by 1,797 votes, made it official and demanded a recount. Then I kind of lived at headquarters trying to manage the various behind-the-scenes operations. We recruited 300 lawyers and accountants to go out and actually shadow the recount effort. So we knew what was going on in every county. We had brought in some lawyers from Washington, from the RNC, who were giving us advice on punch cards, because 2 or 3 of the counties had punch card, Gloucester in particular, that we were worried about. And the hanging Chad issue, if you remember, from Florida. They were all in this election, because every county had a different system of counting their votes. And we had mock machines brought in. We were running training sessions on Morris Avenue at a Holiday Inn, right up the street from where our headquarters was. We had
training people who would then go in and observe the recount
to be sure that it was being handled properly, what the counts really were, where it was going. Lawyers and accountants in reality. There was all kinds of claims being filed and motions that were being handled with. Gary Stein was working with Erwin and a couple of other lawyers up in Erwin Kimmelman. He was counsel to the recount in his office. Judy Yaskin had stepped down in handling the recount because of her partisan background and turned it over to Mike Cole, who was, on behalf of the state, was managing the recount.
Cole's position at the time being?
Was an assistant attorney general in that world. And it went on. The bottom line is that there was also a big issue about armbands, if you remember, in Essex County.
The Ballot Security
task force that the Republican National Committee had put together. And Tom Grealish was in the middle of that. And Tom was handling the legal part of that.
What's your view on that? There was a feeling at the time in Democratic circles that that an organized effort to intimidate minority voters had occurred on election day.
They gave us far more credit than we deserved. There was nothing to it. First, there was no real substance in dollars behind it, and any effort to try to show up and do that was in the jurisdictions, particularly in Essex. There were more Democrats and local ward leaders that were protecting that environment for the Democrats. There was no intimidation in that election at all. At least that was my opinion. I thought it was a red herring that the Democrats were throwing into the race. I give a great deal of credit to George Snyder, who was the prosecutor in Essex County at the time, who I think did a marvelous job in helping protect the integrity of that process within the confines of Essex County.
Excuse me 1 second while I take this jacket off.
Another important thing. Okay. I'll let Mike take his jacket off.
Yeah.
There was a belief on our part and my part. I had handled a number of election cases prior to this, and where it was impossible to determine an outcome because a certain number of votes were in doubt, whether it was a machine problem or a ballot problem, that the courts had been ordering special elections. So I had advised Tom at the very beginning and advised the whole legal team at the very beginning that in my experience, it was not an improbability that there might be a special election called if we weren't able to determine the outcome of the votes. And with, 2-3 million votes cast and they're 1,600 votes apart, get 2 or 3 machines and say they were broken and you can't tell what the outcome was, you could invalidate this election. And what would the courts do at that point? One option was that they would hold a special election. So we advised Tom to stay in an election mode. He had to go back and act like and be sure that he was prepared for the election to be ongoing and that this was still part of the election in the event there was a special election called. Florio didn't do that. He hunkered down and acted very legal and had a lot of very sharp lawyers representing him, but I don't think demonstrated his ability. And we played very loudly that we won the election by 1,797 votes, and if it changed, it was because it was stolen from us. That was a very important, from our perspective, a very important posture to be in. Tom's posture had to be that of a candidate still, and stay as a candidate. And we advised him to do that, and he did that.
How? What did he do?
He kept having regular briefings and press conferences about what he was doing. He appointed Lou Thurston as a potential transition operation because we had won the election. Again, things that highlighted those things.
Just to clarify, that was a very long night, election night.
Yes. Ended about 4 or 5 in the morning.
And at that point, did Kane have a 1,797 vote lead?
Not.
What was the situation?
We sent him home. We didn't know who won. The votes weren't all counted. There were still votes out in various counties. We reconvened about 8 o'clock. We didn't leave the hotel, literally. We left the hotel at 8, down to headquarters. We put a group together to stay at headquarters, which was me and the RNC people that they had sent in. We sent a group up. Erwin was already handling the technical part of the recount. We sent people with Erwin. Gary Stein really went up and really handled the legal issues at Erwin's office. I handled headquarters. We had a group putting volunteers together at that point, and we didn't know the real outcome because there was rumors everywhere about what the real vote was in Essex, or we found 50 votes in a box over in the corner in Camden, and how many hanging chads do we have, until the Secretary of State issued her formal count, which was 1,797 at the time.
And that would have come
the following week.
The following week.
Yes.
So the state went through 1 week of not even having numbers.
Oh, and we had there was a new rumor every day in the paper, for those who remember, about who was winning or who wasn't. And when we finally found out we had 1,797 votes ahead, that's when we developed that strategy that I told you about, or recommended at the time.
In hindsight, that must look like a pretty good strategy.
It was a very good strategy.
Do you remember?
I had always maintained, I told Tom this after we had done the recount, and we had won by 1688, as a matter of fact. It's amazing when you recount millions of votes, and the vote changes that little in the process. And probably 30 or 40,000 votes changed, but the difference was 1688. That if I were representing Jim Florio, I could have forced a special election, I thought, from what was there. But I said, if we have one, I think you're going to win it 2-1.
Why?
Because we had maintained the fact that we had won the election, the message had gotten across. Tom's personality became even more strikingly different, because Florio was absolutely invisible. You couldn't see him. He was gone. Tom was on the scene every day, every other day, and stayed on the scene in that posture as a potential candidate in the event there was one. I think that would have been a disaster. I give Jim Florio an incredible amount of credit for having not put the state through that, seen it intelligently, and decided to concede the election, because he had really lost the election.
Do you recall what Kane's mood was like on election night? Or demeanor?
Perplexed.
Perplexed?
Perplexed. Where are we and how do we get an answer for this? And he was looking for an avenue for that to surface. And not afraid to make decisions, though. One good thing about Tom is he's never been afraid to make a judgment. Give him some data and information, fill him with it, and he'll make a decision. And he absorbs an incredible amount of information in a very succinct way. I have given him volumes of documents and information overnight that he's absorbed and come back with answers. And they weren't, he read this, he understood them, because I would deal with some of the issues with him later. And he was that way about this. He understood that it was in limbo by the next day. And he acted appropriately for it being in limbo, and understanding he could still be a candidate, and he handled it absolutely marvelously on a personal basis going forward, right up through the election day. I remember having that discussion with him around December 3rd, 4th, 5th on the phone. I remember standing in headquarters in Union, and he was up at the House, and giving him that piece of advice. That if I were Jim Florio's lawyer, I could have this election invalidated and a special election held. I thought I could. I said, I think Jim Florio would lose that hands down. I think it'd be foolish if he did it, but the legal capacity is there. And with some of the lawyers around, I knew it from Bergen County alone, from what I saw. And Gabe Ambrosio was the guy running the operation in Bergen, who was very smart, very capable guy. And Weinstein was running the whole thing from Camden for him, who was also a very capable lawyer and could probably have easily seen that. But somewhere along the line, Jim and they decided that they weren't going to challenge that. And that doesn't mean that the election was in doubt. I didn't think the election was in doubt. But I could make it look like it was in doubt if I needed to, and cast enough suspicion to present to the court the option of a special election.
How old were you in 1981?
Let's see. 44, 35 years old.
And Kane is how much older than you?
37 years old I was in 81.
Kane is how much older than you?
10, 12 years older than I am.
Was this a heady experience?
For me?
Yeah.
No, it probably, in hindsight it was, but I didn't think it was heady at the time. I was too busy. I mean, there was a cot down there I was sleeping on. I was getting home about once every 4 days to change my clothes. There was an urgency to everything, and you were consumed by all of the issues that were going on at the time that you don't think about the headiness of it.
Did the prolonged recount affect the transition or the planning for the transition?
There wasn't any transition. I guess it was around the 10th of December, somewhere in that particular 12th, that Jim finally conceded the election. And Tom had Lou Thurston, myself, Jane Bergio, and Erwin Kimmelman in place on Inauguration Day. He decided to go through a very elaborate process of selecting his cabinet. They have to remember that Tom had no real obligations to the county chairman. Tom has had a free hand politically to appoint who he wanted to positions he wanted to. He hired an outside search firm to help him search for candidates for the major appointments, cabinet and others.
In hindsight, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Which is even more, I believe this is part of the foundation, was part of Tom Kaine's foundation, but his freedom to make those appointments his way and pick who he wanted, when, and the people he wanted, was the backbone of success of his administration. Because he not only appointed them, he let them do their job. And all the pieces over the long haul fit, and fit him very well. And he appointed good people. He made a few mistakes along the way. I remember our education, before we got Saul Cooperman, our education commissioner was a problem. But he vetted them well. He had good candidates he was looking at. He was getting the cream of the crop of people that would take a job in government in that period. He was free to appoint Democrats, Republicans, Independents. He appointed, our treasurer was a Democrat at the time.
Who was that?
Starts with a B.
Biederman. Ken Biederman.
Ken Biederman. Great guy, Ken. Very insightful. No agenda. No political agenda, which was very important. He was looking for somebody who had the credibility of the Lou Cadens and the Dick Leones. And Ken had that credibility in the process. But we did something else in that period, which is take the budget back out of the treasurer's office and away from Ken and put it in the council's office with me. That goes back to that.
Let's get to that in a second.
But anyway, he was free to pick cabinet people he wanted, and so he took his time, knowing that he couldn't get it all done by the time he was sworn in. He did his constitutional officers, and I remember us going in and turning on the lights, and if it weren't for Harold Hodes, we'd have been in big trouble. We know the switches were. And there were only about 10 of us in total that were around.
You said you, Jane Bergio, Erwin Kimmelman, and somebody else a moment ago. I don't remember who you said.
Lou Thurston.
Lou Thurston. So Kimmelman was Attorney General, Bergio was Secretary of State.
I was counsel, Lou was Chief of Staff. And
counsel,
Gary Stein was Policy and Planning. That was the five.
Was counsel the job you wanted?
Yes, Tom asked me if I wanted to come into the cabinet. This was around Christmas Eve, the day before, 2 days before. And he wanted to know if I wanted to be Attorney General or would I take a position in the cabinet. I said no, I didn't want a position in the cabinet. I didn't feel I was ready logistically to manage a large department. I came into the legislature supporting him and his policies, and both in '77 and when I got elected. I wanted to have an impact on public policy. And I could have the most profound impact on government and public policy in the council's position. And I wanted the council structured a certain way. And I wanted to take the budget in the governor's office. I believe that's where the rubber hits the road on public policy, and a governor needs to control that, and his office needs to control it. And I said, I want to have a say, and I want my opinion impact your decisions, and you to listen to that opinion on public policy in the state. That's why I'm here. And I could have a more profound effect on public policy as your counsel for a few years than I could if I were Speaker of the Assembly. And on that basis, I would take the council's job. And I would like to have the council's job, but I didn't want anything else.
Could you have become Speaker of the Assembly? You had just won an election.
I was the #2 person behind Dean, and Dean was going to run for Congress probably. And that would have made me the minority leader and ultimately the Speaker if we took control of the legislature 2 years from then, especially with Tom as governor. So it was a reasonable prospect, not a guarantee. But I wasn't enamored with being a legislator or even being speaker. I was enamored with having an impact on public policy. And there's no question that I had my 2 cents, and he listened. Sometimes he followed my advice, and other times he didn't. But I got to do some incredibly great things with him, and programs and problems that I thought were vital for the state planning, for instance, that we did, and our whole accounting and infrastructure, control of the budget, the creation of OMB, which is really his concept, but that I not only endorse but love the product that we produced that they've taken apart today. Moving the budget into the governor's office. Having an open kind of administration was something I wanted to do. I had a Democratic legislature to deal with. I felt very comfortable with the people I knew in the legislature and with Tom as a governor who understood that issue. And our ability to deal with that was going to be paramount. As it turned out, we were more successful, I think, in passing, I think it was only 11 bills in 4 years, issues that we did not get resolved through the Democratic legislature in the 4 years I was counsel. We didn't always get everything we wanted, but we got answers to real problems that were really facing the people of the state.
Wouldn't it have been better for your career to become Attorney General?
Probably. But I wasn't there for that. I didn't ask to get elected in the first place. Once I was there, I got very interested in public policy, as I had been even when I was a kid or even my mother. Earlier you asked about that, and I remember sitting around the dinner table, 10, 12, 13 years old, talking about the funding of welfare. And my mother was talking about a reverse income tax and what that meant. And so she and I would talk about that issue, and my naiveness, we would debate it almost. And so I got the opportunity to be the final advice, to collect the data, to make the priorities, and to try to make the system deliver on public policy initiatives that were important and problems that were important to New Jersey. And from my perspective, that was like dying and going to heaven. And I loved the job. I was the only counsel who was there for 4 years. No one ever lasted 4 years. I know why. I was so burned out at the end. But when I did become Attorney General, it was the easiest job I ever had.
Really?
Coming from the counsel's position.
Really?
Counsel was 100 times harder, much more difficult than Attorney General was like fun. It's like going on vacation and just having a ball every day.
That's a 9,000 person department with 11 divisions.
Yep, and incredible problems. I was so prepared for that after having spent 4 years as counsel. I can't tell you. And I would just a little bit of side lobbying for attorneys general. Our best attorney generals that we've had, in my opinion, John Degnan, John Farmer, all came from the governor's office, counsel. Very effective. The training that you get there, or the training you don't get, attorneys generals don't get when they go into that job, is mind-boggling.
Interesting. During the transition, what changes, if any, were suggested to you by the Byrne people in managing the governor's office or the cabinet or relations with the legislature or whatever?
Harold Hodis over the years became one of my best friends. Harold had been chief of staff at the time, Don here also, gave me incredibly great advice, told me everything I needed to know that he could possibly tell me. But Harold had a degree of loyalty, I guess, and insight into the governor's office that he was never shy to share with me and help us with. And we had to deal with the Democratic legislature. And we needed avenues of communication to be able to do that, and an understanding of who those people were and what their agenda was, who the Alan Karchers of the world was. And so my relationships with various Democrats and Tom's relationships and knowledge of the legislature made that effort during those years invaluable. Tom's freedom as a governor to appoint who we thought were the best people for the job allowed him also to pick who he wanted and not be having to respond to constituent groups or county chairmen that put him in that position.
In your first year in office, you had to hike a tax, and I think Kane proposed one tax increase, a gas tax,
in the first budget.
And the legislature turned around and made him hike the income and the sales tax, or one of the two. They rejected the gas tax.
Our first budget was $188 million in the deficit. That was a lot of money in those particular days. As best we could put the budget, I could put the budget together with the people from Budget and Accounting. This is before we created OMB. We proposed a dedicated 5-cent gas tax to fund transportation projects, which now is a byword. We were unable to get the votes necessary to pass that, and I failed by one vote. Passed it in the Assembly, and we lost it in the Senate because the Republicans wouldn't put any votes up, not the Democrats. And the Carmen Arecchio and John Russo would not post the bill unless we put up like 6 Republican votes. And the Republicans were one vote light on a Monday. By the time they came back on Thursday, they were worried about passing a tax, and there's no tax position. So we lost the gas tax. So we had to cut government, significantly reduce the size of various programs, which we did. And we did it through the line item veto when the budget was passed. And we did something else very significant. I got together with Mike Cole, who was still in the AG's office, and we crafted a line item veto package where we line item vetoed every particular and specific type of appropriation that you can do, knowing that that would aggravate Alan Karcher significantly enough that he would file suit against us to overturn us in abusing our line item veto power. The case is now referred to as Karcher v. Kane. And it's a seminal case on the power of the governor to line item veto language in the budget. If you have an appropriation that says you shall not spend any money on this project, we can scratch off the not and say you shall appropriate. Which means it gave us the ability to rewrite that budget literally and structure the spending programs for the state the way we want. We won that case in the Supreme Court. What winning that case did was allow us to reduce the budget the way we wanted to reduce it. We thought we had to from a priority perspective, which ran right into the Democrats' face. And by December 31st of our first year, they were trying, we had called the legislature back into session to deal with certain shortfalls and program problems. And we had ordered them back, which the governor has the right to do. They'd come in, object, and walk out. They'd convene and leave. There was a battle going on between us and the Democratic legislature about modifications to our taxing policy and our spending policy that we thought were significant. We had commissioned various studies about our taxing structure in New Jersey and what affected our economy and what didn't affect our economy, and what taxes, if they were passed, would affect us and what taxes wouldn't. So we had a standing to know how we were going to affect our economic growth. Ultimately, by about 4 a.m. on December 31st, I arrived at a deal with the legislature that the governor reluctantly said he would sign, that modified about 8 or 9 taxes, reduced a couple, but raised others, all in conformity with this study, these economic studies, about what would affect the economy and what wouldn't. If you raise the sales tax above a certain amount, you lose money. We knew what all those numbers were, and that was what the real debate was. If they wanted to restore the dollars, we would listen to them, but they would have to do it within the confines of this definition that we had laid out.
Michael, can sun on his face?
Okay.
Okay. We have about
10
I'm
minutes.
just going to move him forward and move you back a little bit, Michael.
Okay.
Go an inch forward a little.
Yeah, I'm going to inch you forward. I'll help you out.
Okay.
If we can,
More?
yeah, that might be good. We'll see.
Is that coming from the top?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought I was blocking it, but I'm not. Oh, that's
No, it's
better.
coming from the top.
Yeah, that's better.
Better.
Oops, sorry. I didn't-
Okay.
So we'll do 9 minutes. And you want to continue or you want to quit and come back?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Talking I can do.
So 9 minutes, we'll take a break.
Don't ask me to
Okay.
do 100 push-ups.
Oh, that's next.
No,
After
please.
Hawaii.
After a while, yeah, that's right. I'll have 3 weeks off chemo. I'm going to start working out for a while. I'll be in better shape.
Okay, we have 7 minutes and let's take. Here we go.
As I recall, I think you had to hike the top limit on the income tax a little bit, or
Sales tax.
on the sales tax.
We
Oh,
did not change the income tax.
you did not change the income tax.
And there was estate taxes we reduced, some taxes that we increased. There was a package, and I don't remember all the details of it, but I do remember it passing at the end of the. And Tom, this is a debate that Tom and I had. I was communicating with the legislature for months now, and things we'd accept and we wouldn't, and there was a really solid give and take on that. There was finally an agreement. I remember Chris Jackman was one of our go-betweens, as a matter of fact, in the legislature, and he eventually passed out, and they took him out in the stretcher and brought him back. And oh, it was a wild night. I had 102 temperature. I had the flu that night, and Tom came in the final analysis. We passed the bills at 8:30 in the morning. We had stopped the clock because various taxes, alcohol, cigarette taxes were part of it, that took effect on January 1st. And I'll never forget sitting in the assembly chambers, and I had talked to Willie Brown. Now, Willie Brown was an ardent objector to the sales tax, being from Newark. He had a whole lot of philosophical. I said, Willie, we've been doing this for 4 months. I got a fever. Don't get up on the floor and say anything. And I don't know if you remember the assembly chambers, a little bench in the front of the speaker's podium. I'm sitting on the bench, waiting for this vote to finish. They called for various people to speak, and it had all been orchestrated at that point. And Willie raised his hand and gave a 30-minute dissertation on the sales tax. I went up to him later, and he smiled back at me and he said, I couldn't help myself. He said, I couldn't. Kind of the atmosphere that was going on at the time. There was a knowledge that we had arrived at an agreement, not one that everyone was happy with. We took the bills back to Tom. He had been sitting in the office all night, and he went out and had a press conference. He held his nose and signed the bills.
I remember that.
Because he objected in that political environment to raising those taxes or taxes other than very specific ones for projects like the gas tax. But he said he would sign them as a matter of compromise with the legislature. And he did. And it was part of that ongoing give and take we always had with Alan Karcher and John Rousseau and Carmen Orecchio.
I can't remember whether he literally held his
He did.
nose or
He
whether he
did.
said, I'm signing this while holding my nose.
No, he held his nose. He actually held it. He actually held it.
That must have been a picture in the papers the next day.
Yes, it was. And you know, he really had meant it. That was the fiscal issues. We were, that first year, everybody was very skeptical as to whether we knew what we were doing or not, I think. Lou Thurston was not dealing with the chief of staff's job the way he liked or would have liked to have had it. We eventually, Greg Stevens came in about 2 or 3 months later to take over as chief of staff. First this was when we sold Tom on the practicality that he couldn't, we collectively, he couldn't make his own image, that he needed to bring someone in to handle.
Was that literally what you said to him?
Yes, I said it to him. I know other people said it to him. Greg came in as a former reporter and had someone who had done some work for Tom in his congressional campaign, and to do PR work for him. He wound up being chief of staff a few months later and taking on a much bigger role that put an incredible amount of pressure on Greg. We also had Bob Grady there at the time. No one knew or recognized the talent and the staff we had put together over that year. The cabinet people we had put together, my council staff.
Who on the cabinet?
The entire, George Albany is running Human Services. We decided to pick, and Tom decided to pick a county executive, administrator, to run the most complicated department in state government. Not because of his knowledge about the specifics, but his knowledge about how government delivers services. George did an incredible job in managing the most unmanageable department in state government. Ken Biederman did a terrific job in our fiscal world. We moved the budget out of the treasurer's office to me, but we set Al Fasola up, who's one of the most maniacal characters that I've ever seen in politics, but a brilliant reconstructor of defunct companies, as it turned out. And he built an OMB structure for us and gave it to us that's the finest structure for managing government finances I've ever seen. We implemented that over the next few years. Al was a genius in that world. We couldn't let Al get near politics because he was, you know, a whole different world. I'm trying to think through the rest of the cabinet. Hazel Gluck. Hazel had not supported Tom. The lottery was a mess. Tom finally agreed to put Hazel in the lottery. She cleaned up the lottery for us. Did a tremendous job and wound up moving on to transportation, even though she had not been a Tom Kean supporter. Bob Huey came in as DEP commissioner and tried to put a different spin on what the Department of Environmental Protection was. Remember, Tom was the author of the bill that created the DEP in the legislature. So there were cabinet people that were just some of the best. And the second term was the same way. But Tom was able to have chosen every one of them for their skills and ability in their job. And lastly, before maybe you end this particular segment, he allowed
30 seconds.
He allowed every single cabinet member, every single person in the governor's office, myself, Gary Stein, to do our jobs. He never told us what to do. He allowed each person to run their operation, just tell him what's going on. Be sure he was informed and ask his opinion about what you're doing. You don't have to follow it if you don't think it's right and you convince him you're not. Saul Cooperman in education.
We're going to take a break.
Got it.
We'll get some more.
Well, we isolated. Mike Cole and I isolated or went to the hinterlands of the 8th floor.
Cary, the first year of the Kean administration was perceived as somewhat chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
We were new. To start off with, there's a dynamic about walking in and turning the lights on. I told you there's only 5 of us when we turned the lights on January 20th. We appointed our last cabinet officer at the end of June of that year. There's only 3 people really who had experience in state government. There weren't many Republicans who were around that had ever had it. Myself in the legislature, Tom, and Lou Thurston. Gary Stein was there, was new. There was new people all over the place. And we hadn't finished putting our cabinet together. So we really didn't hit our stride until the end of the first year. We knew where we wanted to go, and we were doing it very methodically, and Tom was doing it very methodically, being sure he picked the right people. He was giving them time to learn their departments, what was going on, because they were new there, make their decisions and their plans. Whether that was Saul Cooperman in education, or Bob Huey, or George Albany's, and setting his own staffs up. But those guys, those people, all got appointed during that first 6 months, and it took them another 5 or 6 months to go forward. Secondarily, the county chairman, Republicans, are calling for jobs, and they're looking for patronage. And we weren't handing out patronage. We were hiring people in government. Tom's role was to bring people in the government who supported his programs, who were going to move those programs forward, he believed honestly, and people he could depend on who had skill. He was vetting high-level appointments through an employment agency to be to be sure we had good people in those jobs. We did miss one of them, which was the thesis for our education commissioner, and we wound up with Saul Cooperman, who...
Do you recall who the first education?
Lewis, a fellow by the name of Lewis. And he had plagiarized his doctoral thesis. And so we abandoned the appointment. We went back to drawing boards. We came up with Saul, and Saul has turned out to be one of the finest national educators in this country. And we had the benefit of him for 2 terms. And he just did an absolutely terrific job. So it was getting everybody in place. It was getting them comfortable in their jobs. We had a game plan. It was about getting Tom to relinquish control of his image making, I guess, from himself, and getting comfortable with that, which he did. Because he had wound up getting good people. Bob Grady came on board as a speechwriter, but he learned about Bob's skills, and Bob Grady has turned out to be, was head of OMB for Bush administration, speechwriter for Bush. He's a terrific guy, bright, capable. As I said, Carl Golden and that. Greg Stevens finally popped up at the end of the year to help deal with that. Tom started worrying about government and not worrying about what he looked like running government. A lot of the people really take charge of that. And he had veto power over it. He never did anything he didn't want to do, but he wasn't trying to mastermind it. And then integrating himself now with each cabinet officer and being sure they understood the latitudes that they had to do what they thought was right, and then them learning their departments.
Do you recall what the first issues he tackled were?
Well, it was really the budget. Was the first issue that thing we talked about before, the gas tax, the budget shortfall. The big issue he tackled, I think the most important one, was the New Jersey New Perfect Together campaign.
How far into the administration was it
We were
when
almost
that was?
a year into the administration when that was finished. But it started with a bunch of advertising firms making proposals and looking at various options and reviewing various things, then him making the decision of final analysis to go with the New Jersey New Perfect Together.
So that was the creation of some ad agency.
Of a group of ad agencies and people, advisors that he picked. I wasn't in the middle of that one. He did that, and they did it. The professionals that he brought in did a terrific job of trying to find out what would click. And the New Jersey New Perfect Together was just perfect for New Jersey.
Why do you think that was? I mean, slogans, one slogan works, one doesn't. It's hard to know why one works.
There was another thing on the ballot in 1981 that people don't remember, and I'll add this to our mix. There was a question on the ballot in the 8 South Jersey counties about seceding from the state because they hadn't been treated fairly in their history. Remember the South Jersey, North Jersey issue? Tom was also, one of his charges to me, and I think to the rest of the cabinet, but me even more specifically, was we have to do something about this separation between North Jersey and South Jersey and make this one New Jersey. The New Jersey and New Perfect Together theme also fit that issue. We opened the South Jersey office, if you remember. I went to great pains to deal with balancing bill sponsorship, recognition, looking for the issues that affected South Jersey and dealing with them legislatively. The departments did the same thing, so that we were one New Jersey. And maybe Tom never gets credit for this, but you don't hear discussions about there not being a one New Jersey anymore. It's disappeared, and I think Tom gets credit for that. The New Jersey New Perfect Together was part of it, but it was really trying to really make it one New Jersey, where we really paid attention to Salem and Gloucester and Camden.
Was it also using state funds to promote the governor? New Jersey and New Perfect Together. He was in the commercials.
Yes, he was. He should be. That's always going to be an argument. Maybe it's one of the perks of being an incumbent, but nobody else should have done it but him. And that was discussed, and he knew and was very sensitive to that political downfall. He always shied away from being someone who was perceived as doing that. But he was so effective in it, and it was so important. And even his accent became a major part of it. When you heard it, when you first heard him do them, you say, he's got to do this. If it promotes him, so be it. He did it, why shouldn't it promote him? Why shouldn't he get the credit for it? And if it worked, and it worked, as well as anything that's ever been done in the state, as far as promoting New Jersey and making this one state. It was a tremendous program, a tremendously successful program, and New Jersey prospered economically, and for years was living on that at levels that no one had ever imagined before.
And people are still joking about that
And
slogan.
they're still joking about it. So him not doing that would have been a mistake. And, you know, maybe there is some political benefit that comes from that, but so is every time he signs a bill. He gets credit for every bill. The legislature that sponsor don't get credit for it. His paper's the front page.
Pardon me?
His name's in the front page. Every governor is.
You say that the budget was the first issue he tackled somewhat of necessity. What issues did he care most about when he came into office?
Education. He was wrestling mightily with the Abbott v. Burke issues and, you know, the funding of education in urban areas. Higher education, college autonomy was put through then. Rick Mills came on board. Major move. When we got dollars in the first term, he put challenge grants together to our institutions of higher education to do economic development issues and growth in things like ceramics, and challenge universities to give them money to develop partnerships with the private sector to enhance our research and development world that we were already in. That, coupled with the challenge grants to college autonomy and moving our state colleges into an autonomous world and challenging them to be the best they could be, is what created the College of New Jersey, and it being an outstanding university across this country, because they had the independence to be able to do that. Those were things. He was interested in all of the environmental issues. He and Saul Cooperman probably talked more than any of the other commissioners about education and where education was going. Saul was a brilliant educational scholar himself.
Where did he come from, Saul?
He was a superintendent of schools.
In
I think somewhere in Essex County.
Maplewood?
Maplewood, maybe, I think, was one of those. But he just turned out to be a brilliant educational leader, and still is, I think, he did for 10 years afterwards. And he and Tom worked all the time on educational issues. Higher educational issues he worked on, environmental issues, the arts. He believed that the arts was a major component of New Jersey's image, that who we were was reflected in more ways than just economically and in jobs. And the arts, and whether it was just all of the arts that Jane Bergio was in fact running, was a personal world of his that he thought was vitally important to show New Jersey as a state that could compete culturally. And he was right. All of those things, for little amounts of money, had a great return in the standing of New Jersey across the country.
What was Kane like as a boss?
Easy. Hard, but easy. I've never had, the only job I ever had that I couldn't be fired from was Attorney General in my life. But you never worried about that. You did your job, you worked hard, you were honest with it, and he never told you what to do or how to do it. He told you what he was looking for, results he was looking for, whether it was me in the council world or Saul in the educational world, or Bob Huey in environment, or Rick Mills. He wanted to know what you had to say. He was an absorber of information, and he could absorb a lot of it. He would read it. He could read at speeds that were just phenomenal. And he would absorb that information and let you run your department. If we in the governor's office tried to interfere in how a department ran their day-to-day operations in any unfound way, that would annoy him. He wanted those departments to be able to run their own show. And that was very difficult for me to deal with because I had to deal with them also their testimony before the legislature and keeping a consistent policy. So allowing them to be independent, but being sure they were consistent in their messages that they delivered to a very hostile Democratic legislature was a balancing act that I was supposed to perform and did.
Who were the key Democratic legislators of that time?
Larry Weiss on the budget, Alan Karcher, of course, during those first 4 years, Carmen Recchio, and John Russo, John Lynch was a major player, and not a major player in a partisan political way, but a government substance way. We were all believed that including Tom, that John Lynch had more potential to be an absolutely superior leader in this state, substantively. That I was personally disappointed as he got angry in the early 90s and became more politically focused. But John was a major player we relied on substance in the legislature. Dean Gallo, while he was there before Dean left, as a leader in the assembly, Dean was a terrific guy to work with because he was honest. He didn't claim to know what he didn't know, would listen to people who did, and would keep his word and would fight for things that he believed that were the right thing to do. The senators were a little more difficult, but the Wayne Dumonts of the world, good leader. Bobby Lytle was another one who was a major player. Bill Gormley, moving over to the Senate when we put Persky on the bench. Bill was as a workaholic and a kind of a frantic, fanatic worker that Gormley was. Ultimately, Bill always did the right thing, governmentally. You could always count on him doing that, notwithstanding all the threats to the contrary and all the other stuff that was around Bill. There were people who would fight for Dr. Lane. There are people who would fight for what was right in government, and that was on the Democratic side or Republican side.
Why couldn't Kane convince Republican senators to vote for the tax bill that he proposed?
They were anti-tax people is the best way to it's hard to describe how conservative they were as a group. Now there were obviously people who were not that, Donnie DeFrancesco wasn't that conservative as a senator, but the Joe Bubbas and the John Paolellas and were just, no tax was any good. Jerry Cardinale, there was no tax he was ever going to vote for. And that was a philosophical position they had taken, which was just not realistic.
How much did Kane involve himself directly in policy and getting legislation through, in political negotiations with county bosses, mayors?
County chairmen or political bosses had no standing in the Kane administration at any level, at any time. I don't think he had a meeting with the Republican county chairman until after the first year he was in office. He even talked to him. He had other people talk to him. So they understood their position was not one of power, but it was one of, if they wanted to talk about substance and do things the right way and submit qualified candidates for positions, we'd listen. But if they were going to submit political hacks and for patronage, there was no place for it. Getting that message across to the bosses was something he did early and never had to backtrack on.
Could a mayor get in to see him?
Depends who the mayor was. Could the mayor of Newark get in to see him anytime he wanted? And it didn't matter who the mayor of Newark was. If there were people of integrity who wanted to, who had real problems, he would see them. Constituent groups. If I needed him to see legislators, anytime I wanted, could bring anybody I wanted in. He would talk to them. People had to be very careful, though, when they walked out of the office. As Tom sat there and waved his head up and down, that didn't mean, yes, I agree. It means, yes, I hear you. It was my job to remind them, as they left, that nod did not mean he's supporting your position. It means he heard your position. And that's what we brought you here to say. And he would talk to him. We got in a lot of fights about senatorial courtesy. It was a big bone of contention with us, as it is with every governor. He challenged it very directly with a number of senators. And we talked about that very often. But we had an open door policy, not just in my office, where we listened to anybody's problem, but he would, if we could get them in the schedule, and they were sincere, and they had a real issue to bring to him, he would make time for them.
So at the same time that he gave his cabinet and his staff lots of room, would you say he was still a hands-on manager?
No, he was not a hands-on manager. He was a hands-on policymaker and decision-maker. He used all of this to absorb information so he could make better decisions. Ultimately, every governor, the effect every governor has on the state is the actual decisions they actually make. And those decisions are very important. And some he was dead right on, most of them he was dead right on. But some of them were also very controversial. We'll look at the South African issue that he took a very tough stand on.
Divestment of state pension monies in companies that did business in South Africa. Now, let's stay with that for 1 second. You said earlier that when he would run for re-election, he'd get a greater percentage of the black vote than any governor in history.
Any Republican.
Any Republican.
That's correct.
Was it because of that South Africa issue?
No, it was because he understood the community. He had grown up in that community. His friends in Essex were out of Newark and Irvington. He understood those constituencies very well.
That issue didn't hurt.
It didn't hurt, but it was not the deciding issue, I don't think, in the support of that community. I think he had it before he did that.
What mistakes were made early on?
We moved very deliberately and slowly. That didn't turn out to be a mistake in the long run, but in the short run, it gave a lot of angst to a lot of people that first year. As to whether we knew what we were doing, we thought we did. He thought he did. And it took some time to successfully put it all together. The economy did turn around in New Jersey and nationally, but in New Jersey even more so. And our campaigns to enhance that economy continued to produce dollars. If I think the administration made any mistakes, during the first 4 years, we took all of those surplus dollars and invested them in one-time expenditures, not in ongoing programs, because they were surplus dollars. And in the second term, he tended to bow to the needs of the urban areas particularly, and put dollars into ongoing programs in which the surplus would not always be repeated. And if you remember the savings and loan debacle at the end of Keynes' first term, the economy turned around and the revenues reduced, and the surpluses weren't there. And the ability to fund those programs didn't continue. I thought we made bad judgments in the last 4 years on how we spent the excess revenues we were developing by a booming economy and or by budget surpluses, and didn't by committing them to long-term projects. And Tom was torn during that period, and I know because we talked about it a number of times. The problems that existed in Newark. I was doing the Drug-Free Schools program. We were trying to put major educational programs within the schools. There were people in the Boys and Girls Clubs in Newark who were also doing the same things and working to enhance those educational opportunities. Tom said, I can't sit here with these dollars and see that need and not do something about it. So it was it a mistake? Physically it was a mistake. Was it a mistake? He would probably say it wasn't, because he was responding to what he thought were the priorities of those kids at that point in time, and would work the rest of those problems out later. He was also believed, and this is interesting, you didn't have to have a perfect piece of legislation. Nobody should ever watch legislation being made. It's like watching sausage. We usually have to do it 2 or 3 times before we get it right, legislation. Most major bills get amended to it. He was willing to live with a problem in a bill, knowing that he could come back later and would come back and fix it. The same thing would pop up on these issues of spending. He wanted to deal with the problem and see if there was a solution begun that he knew could evolve into a better one. The spending was a debate between good fiscal responsibility and his personal conscience, or what he thought were real needs. He was a great believer in that the system would fix itself. If you have good people trying hard, they'll find a way. And we shouldn't be worried too much about, overly worry. Take care of the problem in front of you today. I used to scratch my head about that a little bit because my physical accountability was to be sure we had enough dollars to take care of all those people over a longer period of time. And we used to debate that issue. I don't know who was right. Even to this day, I don't know who was right. I can't say he was wrong, but there is another side to that discussion.
The counsel's office was perceived to be very effective after you reorganized it, I guess.
Yes.
How did you reorganize it?
I had a Democratic legislature. I knew the legislature wanted to be independent. I knew they weren't going to give us the time of day. I knew I was in for a war. So I knew I needed to structure a system in which we had as many open lines of communication as I could create and as many interactions as I could create. And I had a very young staff. So I had probably 16 to 20 lawyers in my office, as opposed to John Degnan that maybe had 5 or 6. Don, I think that's accurate. We were dealing with a Democratic legislature that was going to put us through our paces. And I thought I needed a staff and a structure that could do that. I set a staff and a structure that had both the ability to communicate on any legislative issue or any departmental issue, as a matter of fact, as it interacted, and interact with the legislative committee, staff, OLS, and all the people we had to interact with, and was available to the outside constituent world to hear their positions with reference to it, and move our agenda forward one way or the other. And it probably took me 2 years to get that staff up and trained, because they didn't know where the bathrooms were when they started, some of them. But I kept some very good people, Amy Pirro being one of them, who I talked about before, who in reality was a Democrat. And the counsel's office nowadays, and since then, has not measured the assistant counsels by what their political background was, but by what their skills were and were they prepared to make allegiances to represent that client. And our theory was that we always represented one client that had a lot of files. And it didn't matter what our opinions were or whether we agreed or disagreed. We were there to represent this governor's interest on public policy and the formation of it, and to give him what he needed to make the decisions he needed to make. And they would always have the right to put their opinion in on it, and the legislators, individual, committee, everyone's opinion into that mix, which they did. And you can't do that. Lastly, you can't take the budget into the governor's office and run it from the governor's office without people and staff. I had a great budget and accounting operation and ultimately a great OMB, but I still needed 4 or 5 people to do that and interact with Larry Weiss. And I think we did that more successfully, budgetarily, than anyone before or since.
You've made reference several times to bringing the budget process into the governor's office, and you referred to OMB. But OMB today is part of the Treasury Department. Yes. Was it still?
It was part of Treasury, but it reported to me.
It reported to you. And you made that happen?
Accounting, yes. Budget and accounting reported to me. Rich Keevy, as a matter of fact, was the head at the time. They reported directly to me. They kept Ken informed about what was going on, and Ken would interject whenever I wanted him to, Biederman, or whoever the treasurer was. But I actually went through the budget process. I did the budget briefings for the media. I knew every number that was in that budget. I worked it through personally, worked it through the Joint Appropriations Committee, which is why the people like Larry Weiss and the former county executive in Hudson County, who ultimately wound up in jail, was the Democratic counterpart. I worked with both of them to put budgets together for those 4 years, and very successfully. We got our budgets, and we got them. We had a good give and take, and I enjoyed it.
Were there any turf conflicts between the governor's office and Treasury once?
No, I don't think so. Originally, I think Ken was a little out of sorts about it, Biederman, but once he understood, it was a headache he didn't know anything about. He didn't know how the legislature worked. He had never dealt with the legislature before, and ultimately was very willing to relinquish that. And as I said, I believe no governor should be making judgments on public policy without knowing he has the resources to back it up. And the resources are put together in the budget and the budget process and the approval. And it's a 12-month process. It's not a 1 month, not when he just issues it. And so I kept Tom up to date on our income and our budgeting issues and problems and appropriations all through the process. And he would make policy judgments as we went along based on the memos or positions I was taking or compromises I was making with the legislature, knowing that we had certain options in the final analysis and a great deal of leverage on the line item veto.
As counsel, did you have a role in judicial and prosecutor appointments?
I did all judicial and prosecutorial appointments. I did none of the other political appointments. That was handled by the Appointments Office and the Chief of Staff. And I had a very good little group of people who did our interviews. Don helped me immensely on how they did it in the Byrne years. But I was dealing with a governor who wasn't a lawyer. And he was dealing with a governor who had been a judge. There's a mile of difference between those two. Tom's opinion about lawyers is much more universally held by the general public, as opposed to Brendan's opinion about lawyers and judges. Tom would say, this fellow looks like a good judge. He looks like he'd make a good judge. So he relied very heavily on me, and I continued to use Judge Waugh and some other people doing quiet backgrounds and the background checks that we would do on various candidates and give to him as potential candidates.
When you became Attorney General, did you retain some influence in that area?
Prosecutors, because of the chief law enforcement responsibilities I had that I took very seriously and did work with. And Mike Cole had moved over as Chief of Staff, as counsel, and Mike was very willing to let me do that without feeling. Mike wasn't a turf person anyway. He was a result-oriented individual and great to work with, so it was easy.
Don is reminding me that the death penalty was an issue back then, and that Byrne had vetoed a death penalty bill.
Yep.
What was your advice to Kane on that issue?
Well, we could pass a death penalty bill, but if I did it and I put one together for him, which he wanted a death penalty bill, it would be one that guaranteed the rights of individuals, that they wouldn't be, let me say, maliciously prosecuted, or that they ever would lack resources to get a fair trial. And we put tens of millions of dollars into our death penalty defense. And I know Tom had talked to Brendan about it privately, but he believed that ultimately the ultimate penalty of a death penalty does act as a deterrent to the person standing there with a gun or in a circumstances, and they're going to make a choice not to murder somebody or kill somebody because the death penalty is the final word. But we put together a structure that has never seen anybody suffer the death penalty in New Jersey. A very stringent one, in which it's maybe too stringent in our efforts. None of us were fans of a death penalty. I used to say that the surrender that we gave to a death penalty, which I surrendered to also, was a surrender to mediocrity. rather than find a very complex and difficult punishment system that was equal to or greater than the death penalty. And that we as a society were opting for the easy way out as opposed to the much more harder judicial way out, where you could tailor a punishment per individual that was maybe more severe than the death penalty in certain circumstances. Sometimes the death penalty is too uniform, and that punishment should be more tailored and more options given to judges. That politically is too difficult for the general public to accept as not being something that would be played with or manipulated.
If my recollection is correct, it was 1982 when the legislature reinstated the death penalty, and Keynes signed that bill.
Correct.
John Rousseau was the author of that bill.
That's right.
And as you point out, it's never been used.
Well, it's been used, but people have gotten the death penalty, but the defenses and dollars available for their defense and its actual implementation, no one's ever been put to death.
In hindsight, do you think that the scheme we created, where we have a death penalty that's never been implemented and that has cost tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on both sides, the prosecution and the defense, is the right public policy?
Yeah, I think it was the right public policy at the time. I think it was, the public had a right to, and a governor has a right to know he believes that's a real deterrent. It had the effect the governor wanted. It had the effect of not prosecuting people who shouldn't be. I believe it probably should have been implemented probably in a couple of cases ultimately by now, and thought it would have been, but I'm not sad that it isn't.
One of the trade-offs of expanding a governor's staff is lack of direct access of staff members to the governor and a more bureaucratic atmosphere. Do you agree with that, or?
No. Governors can make time for their staff. Every one of my assistant counsels had as much time as they wanted with the governor on a bill that they worked on, if they worked on it hard, and Tom made time for it. He relied on him, and I asked him to do that, and he never, ever let me down, ever. He would sit with assistant counsels and listen to everything they had to say about a bill. It maybe was an important bill, it may not so important. But they all had direct face time and discussions, and if they wanted me out of the room, I'd leave if they thought I might be too persuasive on the opposite side. And I think that was very important for all of them, and I think they all appreciated it.
Whose call was that?
Mine.
That was your call?
That was mine. The governor, as I said, he would meet with anybody I asked him to. And as long as we were succeeding in getting his agenda moved, which we did, in ways that he was satisfied with, he was absolutely willing to do anything I asked him.
You say that in the second year, Greg Stevens came in,
right,
first as communications director, I believe,
right,
and subsequently as chief of staff,
replacing
Lou Thurston
right,
as chief of staff. Thurston's background was he had been an executive director in the legislature,
the Senate.
Senate Republicans.
Right.
What did Stevens was perceived of as a big success and a welcome change and so on. What did Stevens bring to the position that had been lacking under Thurston?
That's a real good question. Lou is a brilliant public servant. But like most public servants, they're not paid to make decisions. The part-time people who come into government are paid to make the decisions. If you ask a bureaucrat and somebody in government to decide every public policy issue, they won't do it. And if they do it, they're afraid they'll get blamed politically as a fall guy for the failure of that policy. So I found that cabinet members and part-time people who come in should make those decisions. And if you do that as a part-time person coming into the executive branch of government, the bureaucrats will kill themselves for you. They'll give you all the advice you want. They'll tell you what they believe is the right thing to do. and what is the wrong thing to do. You can follow it or not follow it, as long as you take responsibility for making the decision. Lou Thurston is one of the best public servants I know, one of the most insightful public servants I know, with incredible insight into all issues. He doesn't make decisions. He's part of that career bureaucracy who does not make them. And he didn't. You can't be chief of staff to a governor and not make decisions.
What was Greg Stevens' background?
He was a reporter, communications, public relations. Understand elections. He had worked in a number of campaigns as a communication director, so he understood the politics of that, but that was his weak side. And if there was any problem that Greg had, was he came in very strong in building Tom's image and helping him do that and make those decisions so that Tom wasn't managing his own image, and stumbled and fought mightily with all the politics and the appointments and the politics and the backbiting and that whole world. It drove him nuts, literally put pressure on Greg that was incredible. But he was very good at it, and he was not afraid to make decisions, and hard decisions, and hard political decisions. Like county chairman. If that was the governor's position, you weren't going to see him. Simple. And he would enforce that. And he managed not only the governor's office, who he really delegated that to his successor as chief of staff.
Ed McGlynn.
Ed McGlynn. Ed McGlynn kind of managed the office. Greg managed the governor. Greg managed the politicians, the appointment process, and they were a good team, Ed and Greg. They did a terrific job for the governor and for the office. Greg and I used to butt heads about policy. I'm over there working on public policy. He's worried about the political impact of that policy, and we developed a reputation of being enemies, which wasn't accurate. We just were combatants on policy issues, where he was looking at it purely politically, and I was looking at it purely from a public policy. And Tom became the arbitrator, and he was a great arbitrator.
Carl Golden had been the spokesman. Did Stevens coming in create any friction between those two?
No. For some reason, Carl's a pretty strong personality, and I think Greg understood how strong and how valuable Carl was, and he was just as dependent on Carl as the governor was. And the other player was Bob Grady, who gets very little credit, but deserves an incredible amount. All the speeches, all of the State of the State messages, he wrote them all. He had an insight into policy, public policy, and communications that was just invaluable. I can't tell you how valuable it was. The team that was there, me, Greg, Carl, Bob Grady, Ken Merony was my deputy, still with all that background. We always knew what Tom's positions were because Ken had them locked up in his desk that we had taken during the campaigns. We were never inconsistent. There was a photograph taken, and I still have it home somewhere. If I could find it, I'd love to, of all of us sitting around. That was an incredibly balanced team of people with balanced skills that worked brilliantly together, just brilliantly. And Tom let us work. He never interfered. He used to incite us to fight with each other once in a while, I think, because he liked to stir the pot, because he loved the debate. He loved us arguing about those issues, and even transferring them back to him, because it gave him more input. And he liked the debate with the cabinet too. If we would think the cabinet officer was off the reservation, he would encourage the debate and encourage the cabinet officer to keep his independence and not let us overpower him.
I'm handed a note that says that Greg Stevens worked for Olympia Snow of Maine.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And he wound up as his career when he left us as a professional electing candidates across this country.
a Republican consultant, a
consultant of
campaign consultant.
and of great successes and great failures. When I ran for governor years later, without charge, he came bounding up here to New Jersey and traveled with me for weeks to try to get me to understand the value of the message, which I never got for multiple reasons. And I probably was I'm never a good candidate because I can never get that capacity to focus back on the message the way he tried to help me do it. But personally, he came back 10 years later, you might say, and was just an incredible help to me.
Do you recall any interactions in that first term with the federal government or federal issues or the White House? You had Ronald Reagan in the White House, so you had a friend, a Republican friend in the White House.
Well, yeah, sometimes, yes. That depended on the week and the issue and where Tom was. And yeah, Tom was, I think, elected. He was in Washington at a dinner, governor's dinner with the president. He was elected one of the 10 best dressed in the country.
Kane was?
Absolutely.
What did you think of that?
I thought it was a joke. Yeah, we had a lot of interaction. We set up a Washington office. We had a Democrat, Marilyn Thompson, who ran that office. We had probably one of the most aggressive, and that had been a Byrne office that got set up. We enhanced it dramatically. And our actions in Washington through the office were very aggressive and very professional with people who really knew what they were doing within the confines. Our issues, whether it be in transportation and human services, were more than intertwined with the federal government on a daily basis. And our ability to interact with them through the Washington office was just terrific. And Maryland and the staff take a great deal of credit for that. And Tom spent a lot of time with them and those issues.
It's hard to sort out first term from second term issues, and at some point we have to talk about the '85 campaign. But let me pull out from my memory some of the big legacy issues that Kane tackled. GMIP, the Governor's Management Improvement Plan. What was that all about?
That was just a way to help manage. OMB came out of that. That was an effort by the governor to try to understand how to manage the day-to-day activities of state government better. And as I said, OMB came out of that, and the benefits of GMIP got into the 12-month budget process that every department had to go through. The creation of the Department of Personnel versus Civil Service Commission was also done with Gene McCaffrey as the head of that kind of spun out of that we needed a personnel department that interacted with, so that was GMIP. GMIP was important, but I wouldn't put it way up on our list of achievements.
What would you put way up on the list of achievements?
Our economic development programs in the first term, and it's the New Jersey and UPERF together, but it's all the other incentives that were put in place along with that to move the economy forward and to move New Jersey's economy forward. The second term was the time that I think we hit our biggest home runs. We did hit all the Transportation Trust Fund, the Environmental Trust Funds were all put together during that first term, which were all financial and economic engines, you might say, to move our infrastructure forward so we could support our industries. Second term, Drew Altman came out of a major foundation that had been studying welfare. And the welfare reform program that is now nationally and that Wayne Bryant said he introduced, all were created by Drew Altman in the second term. Molly Coy's work on health and the certificate of needs processes, and what we did in health in New Jersey stand out as some of the more outstanding things that we did. But the first term was our infrastructure banks, our work with New York, the Port Authority, transportation issues, the economy, challenge grants to our colleges and universities. College autonomy was introduced, and it didn't get passed till the first 6 months of our second term.
Merit pay for teachers, was that it?
That was an issue that was on the table that they were playing with, yes.
Do you recall how that one got resolved?
Didn't get resolved.
School takeover, that was a big issue at some point in the Kane years. Remember that one?
Yes, but not a significant issue, nor one that he and Saul worked on a lot of those kinds of issues. But it was the quality of education, the quality of teachers, and the availability of resources in urban areas that Tom, I think, worked on dramatically.
Minimum teacher salaries, another one. I think the minimum was raised significantly during the Kane.
Yes, it
era.
was. As was the minimum of police officers in New Jersey. State police, state troopers also changed during the Kane years. Yes.
And the alternate route for teachers.
Alternate route
was another
very
big one.
big deal.
Yes.
That was probably bigger. I had forgotten about that one. Both Tom and Saul were committed to getting quality teachers in place, and the rigidity of the NJEA's rules for teacher licensing that made a closed shop out of everything. They successfully negotiated, put in place, is still in place as an alternate route to get quality people who didn't come through the normal educational world to get into the teaching world because of their capacity and expertise, and has materially enhanced the quality of education across the state in almost every district.
In the environmental area, I remember major wetlands legislation. Was that
Right to know?
Right to know? Yes.
Right to know was a big one that was challenged and overturned by the chemical industry.
The law was invalidated?
Yes, it was. I'm trying to think of some of the others in the environmental. There was a number of environmental initiatives that happened during that period.
Freshwater
wetlands.
State planning.
State Planning Act, which was, the COA legislation that came into effect. Better management. Trying to convert, which Tom attempted to do, the DEP from being a cop to having a major permitting responsibility that was an affirmative responsibility, not an enforcement responsibility, was a second-term initiative that was just a never-ending battle to try to get the permitting process streamlined and effective. The Department of Environmental Protection, under Tom's original leadership, became an environmental cop. And no matter what they did, they were punishing everybody. If you had a permit, which you had a right to get, they were acting like you were committing a crime by applying for the permit, and were finding any way they could to slow it down or not grant it. And that had to do with developments and various other things.
Were there any issues that you personally cared about that you pushed on Kane?
I don't remember pushing them. I know we were responsible. I was responsible constantly for identifying problems that were out there and various solutions that were either in the legislature. And I did that on a regular basis, monthly, every year. I did recamps on it. Whenever we get around budget time and state of the state, we would go back and rehash everything we had done, what problems were out there, where did we have to go next to move something forward. Civil service reform, for instance, was very difficult. It was when we couldn't get through the first term that got done in the second term.
Did that? Okay, that's right.
It did get done. It got done the end of the first year. We didn't quite finish the college autonomy. That got passed. I stayed, after I was AG, working with the college presidents to get college autonomy in place, along with the challenge grants that went with that, which have now developed, other than the recent problems, it's been a success.
You recall any policy of the administration that you strongly disagreed with?
No. I have to say this. I had an uncanny ability after being with Tom. Maybe it's the lawyer in me. I never could quite figure it out. But I was asked regularly to go out and debate Alan Karcher or any Democrat that wanted to debate Tom Kean on a policy issue. And I was very rarely did I talk to Tom before I went out and did. I was doing it once, 2, 3 times a week. My trips to Atlantic City were never ending. Because Tom would not debate Alan Karcher personally, or John Russo, or various other Democrats. And so I was asked publicly many times to have to take positions on Tom's behalf, and I would do it without talking to him. And I never remember having been wrong, or him coming back to me and saying, you chose something that was not that I disagree with.
You two guys were that in sync?
It was more me, I think, than him. I think I understood his personality, what he wanted. I knew how he stood on almost everything. Going back to the campaign and the issues, I had spent so much time with him that I instinctively knew what direction he would take. And I knew how to couch my statements in such a way that, I could say what he would say. Now remember, I'm his counsel. This isn't my administration. This is Tom Kean's administration. So my job was to be an alter ego to him to the extent I could and move his programs forward, not mine. My deal with him was he had to listen to me as to what my opinion was. But beyond that, I had to implement what he wanted done. And a good lawyer can do that. If you get to know our client pretty well, we know what they're going to do before they do it. And if you worked as closely as I did on as many issues, instinctively, I understood what he wanted. And I don't think I ever made a major faux pas publicly in taking a position without ever talking to him.
Alan Karcher was the dominant Democrat in the State House,
Yes.
I would say.
Absolutely.
At that time.
Dominant personality, yes.
Dominant personality. A large personality.
Yes.
A brilliant man.
Yes.
The foil, in a way, for
Perfect
the Kean
foil.
administration. How so?
Perfect foil.
How so?
Well, first, there was a different Alan Karcher every 6 months. I'll never forget, Alan went on a trip to the Mediterranean, and he went through the Greek Isles, and then he went down to the Middle East and went through Israel and Egypt, and he came back tan, wearing sandals, long beard, and he comes in and he saunters into my office, and he said, "How you doing? What a great trip. I'm a new man. No more confrontations. I've studied various religions while I was there. We're going to have so much fun for the next couple of years." So, and really, I mean, he's tan and he's got sandals on. And I said, "Oh, not another Alan Karcher. I don't know if I can stand it." And he was very sincere, quit smoking, wasn't drinking anymore of any word. So he leaves the office. I go in and I said, "Tom, you got to talk to Alan. I got to bring Alan in this. You got to hear Alan Karcher today." So I said this, I bring him in, and same. "Oh, this is going to be great." And about 30, 45 days go by. It's the summertime. It's the end of the summer. Not a lot's going on. We come back. It's October. I don't remember the issue, but it hit him the wrong way. And the old Alan showed back up again, and we're almost arm wrestling on the time of day, much less. So Alan Karcher, as brilliant as he was, and he was, as committed as he was to his philosophical positions, and as tough a debater as he was, underneath it all, and this is what the moral to the story is, really wanted to be and wanted to and do the right thing for the state of New Jersey. And when push came to shove, he would always do it. Always. And I use the State Planning Commission as an example. He was so mad at the other senator from Mercer,
Jerry Stockman.
Jerry Stockman. Jerry was the sponsor of the State Planning Commission Act. He wouldn't post the bill because Jerry had done something underhanded and dirty that I said, Alan, you can't, 6 months, you can't keep doing this. He says, all right. And Jerry never backed off, and he passed the bill, and he posted it. Without me, I didn't have to pay anything, we didn't have to, no agreements, no anything. Of course, I never did that anyway during the 4 years we were there. And we really didn't. We set that tone from the beginning with both Republicans and Democrats. There were no trades. There were no trades for votes. There were no trades for things that you wanted. If you worked with us and you helped us, you had a problem, come to me with a problem, and we'll try to work with you with it. But there was no quid pro quos, ever. And that worked. So I could go to Alan and say, Alan, you got to stop. You got to pass. This is much more important than your debates with Jerry Stockman. And Alan would do it. And in the final analysis, he did that with almost everything that was important for the state of New Jersey.
Did Karcher overplay his hand?
Yes. Alan helped re-elect Tom Kean. There's no question about it. Tom's refusal to debate him and sending me out to debate him all the time. Once a week for like 2-3 years. I was on some podium somewhere debating Alan on an issue, a piece of legislation or something.
Alan shouldn't have debated you?
No. And he shouldn't. He fell into that particular morass because he just couldn't help himself. Just like he couldn't help himself when he came back from the Greek Isles and he was faced with, Alan was a combative trial lawyer and he had to fight. And he needed something, he didn't care who, many times. So I was the perfect candidate and not Tom Kean. That diminished his effectiveness, enhanced Tom's effectiveness. And legislators didn't understand, and governors don't understand sometimes. I don't think Jim Florio originally understood this. You don't have to be at the head of the parade to take credit for the outcome. And governors get credit for the outcome no matter what, the good and the bad. And smart governors who understand the legislative process will give credit out all day to any legislator, sponsor a bill, Alan Karcher for supporting a bill, say nice things about him. Ultimately, the governor gets credit for its success and gets the blame for its failure. And if you understand that, you don't need to be at the head of the parade, as Jim Florio insisted on doing on the tax bill in his first 6 months, and on a number of other occasions. But Tom understood that, and we understood that. So ultimately, the success was more important. So knowing your subject matter, being sure you passed the right bill, being sure the right thing was done, was the most important piece of what you did, because as a governor, you're going to get the credit or the blame for its success or failure.